100 Facts about the Roman Empire. Picture this, a civilization that began as a collection of mud huts on 7 hills beside the Tiber River, growing into an empire that would dominate the known world for over 1,000 years. The Roman Empire wasn't just powerful, it fundamentally shaped the world we live in today. From our languages and laws to our architecture and engineering. We're going to explore 100 incredible facts about Rome. And trust me, by the end, you'll understand why people say they think about the Roman Empire every day. Let's begin our journey in 753 BCE with the legendary founding of Rome itself. Fact 1. Rome's legendary founding by Romulus. Rome was allegedly founded by Romulus on April 21, 753 BCE, after he killed his twin brother Remus in a dispute over where to build their city. According to legend, the twins were sons of the war god Mars and were raised by a she-wolf after being abandoned in the wilderness. When it came time to establish a city, Romulus favored the Palatine Hill while Remus preferred the Aventine Hill. After Remus mockingly jumped over Romulus's wall, Romulus killed him, declaring that anyone who dared breach his walls would meet the same fate. While modern historians debate the truth of this myth, archaeological evidence does suggest Rome began as a settlement around the 8th century BCE, making the legendary date surprisingly close to reality. Fact 2. The 7 kings before the Republic. Before becoming an empire, Rome was ruled by 7 kings over a period of about 244 years. These kings, starting with Romulus and ending with Tarquin the Proud, established many of Rome's foundational institutions. The 4th king, Ancus Marcius, built Rome's first bridge across the Tiber. The 5th king, Tarquinius Priscus, began construction of the great Circus Maximus for chariot racing. But it was the last king, Tarquin the Proud, whose tyrannical rule became so unbearable that in 509 BCE, the Roman aristocracy revolted and expelled him. This revolution marked the end of the Roman kingdom and the birth of the Roman Republic, a system of government that would last nearly 500 years and influence democratic systems for millennia to come. Fact 3. The Republic's system of government. The Roman Republic operated under a complex system of checks and balances, with 2 consuls elected annually to prevent any single person from gaining absolute power. These consuls held equal authority and could veto each other's decisions, ensuring that no one could act as a king. Below the consuls sat the Senate, composed of about 300 aristocratic members who advised on policy and controlled state finances. The Roman people were divided into different assemblies based on wealth and military status, and these assemblies elected officials and voted on laws. This intricate system, with its separation of powers and representative elements, would later inspire the founders of the United States Constitution over 2,000 years later. The Romans were so committed to preventing tyranny that breaking the power-sharing arrangement could result in execution. Fact 4. The emergency dictator position. In times of extreme crisis, the Roman Republic could appoint a dictator with absolute power, but only for a maximum of 6 months. This emergency measure was used sparingly and effectively throughout the Republic's history. The dictator could make decisions without consulting the Senate or other officials, marshal troops, and take whatever actions necessary to save the state. But here's the remarkable part. Most Roman dictators willingly gave up their power before the 6-month limit expired, once the crisis was resolved. The most famous example is Cincinnatus, who, in 458 BCE, was called from his farm to lead Rome against an invading army. He defeated the enemy in just 16 days and immediately resigned his dictatorship to return to his plow. This story of selfless service became legendary, inspiring leaders throughout history, including George Washington, who similarly relinquished power after the American Revolution. Fact 5. Roman citizenship and integration. The Romans didn't just conquer their enemies, they often integrated them, extending citizenship to conquered peoples and creating a diverse empire bound by common law and opportunity. This was revolutionary for the ancient world, where most empires simply enslaved or exploited their conquered populations. The Romans developed several tiers of citizenship, with full citizens enjoying complete legal rights, including the right to vote, hold office, and appeal legal decisions all the way to Rome itself. This policy of integration created loyalty throughout the empire and provided a constant supply of soldiers, administrators, and taxpayers. By 212 CE, Emperor Caracalla extended full Roman citizenship to nearly all free inhabitants of the empire, encompassing millions of people across 3 continents. A peasant in Spain, a merchant in Egypt, or a soldier in Britain could all proudly say, "Civis Romanus sum." I am a Roman citizen. Fact 6. Roman concrete technology. Roman engineering prowess gave us concrete, and their version was actually more durable than what we use today. The Romans invented a form of concrete using volcanic ash, lime, and seawater that not only hardened underwater, but actually grew stronger over time through a chemical reaction with seawater. This allowed them to build massive harbors, aqueducts, and buildings that have survived for 2,000 years. The Pantheon in Rome, completed in 128 CE, still stands with its unreinforced concrete dome, the world's largest for over a millennium, and shows no signs of collapsing. Modern scientists studying Roman concrete have discovered that the volcanic ash created a rare mineral called aluminum tobermarite, which continues to crystallize over centuries, filling in cracks and making the structure more robust. Ironically, the Ivai recipe for this superior concrete was lost after the fall of Rome, and only in recent years have researchers begun to unlock its secrets. Fact 7. Military engineering and roads. The Roman military wasn't just the most powerful fighting force of its time. It was also the ancient world's greatest engineering corps, building roads, bridges, and fortifications wherever they went. Roman soldiers were expected to carry up to 60 pounds of equipment and march 20 miles per day, then build a fortified camp every single night. These temporary camps followed a standardized layout so precise that a soldier transferred between legions would know exactly where to find the latrines, command tent, and his own quarters in complete darkness. But the Romans' most lasting achievement was their road network. At its peak, the empire maintained over 250,000 miles of roads, with 50,000 miles being paved stone highways. These roads were engineering marvels, built in multiple layers with drainage systems, and so well constructed that many are still in use today. The famous Appian Way, built in 312 BCE, remains partially intact after more than 2,300 years. Fact 8. Wolf symbolism in Roman culture. Rome's legendary founder wasn't the only one raised by wolves. The Romans used she-wolf imagery throughout their culture, and they actually kept wolves in the city as sacred animals. The she-wolf that nursed Romulus and Remus became the ultimate symbol of Roman identity, appearing on everything from military standards to coins to public monuments. The Romans believed wolves were sacred to Mars, their god of war, and saw them as symbols of strength, loyalty, and martial virtue. In the Forum, priests called the Luperci would perform annual rituals involving wolf imagery to ensure fertility and protect the city. The Romans also maintained a complex relationship with the natural world that modern people might find surprising. They kept detailed records of unusual animal sightings and weather events, believing these were omens sent by the gods. A wolf entering the city would cause a massive response, as priests would need to interpret whether this was a blessing or a warning. Fact 9. The Roman timekeeping system. The Roman day didn't have fixed hours like ours. Instead, they divided daylight and darkness each into 12 hours, meaning an hour was longer in summer than winter. This flexible system meant that the first hour of the day always began at sunrise, and the 12th hour always ended at sunset, regardless of the season. In summer, a Roman hour might last about 75 modern minutes, while in winter it could be just 45 minutes. This makes reading ancient Roman accounts of time somewhat confusing for modern historians. The Romans told time using sundials during the day and water clocks at night. Despite this imprecise system, Romans were obsessive about punctuality for business and social obligations. The wealthy would employ slaves specifically to track time and remind them of appointments. Fact 10. Roman dining customs. Romans ate lying down, reclining on couches during elaborate dinner parties that could last for up to 10 hours. These events, called convivia, were central to Roman social and political life. Guests would recline on their left side, propped up by cushions, leaving their right hand free to eat. The dining room, or triclinium, typically had 3 couches arranged in a U-shape around a central table. Seating position indicated social status, with the most honored guest receiving the locus consularis, or consul's place. These marathons of eating featured multiple courses of exotic foods, peacock, dormice, flamingo tongues, interspersed with entertainment, poetry readings, and political discussions. It was at these dinner parties that much of Rome's real power was negotiated, away from the formal proceedings of the Senate and Forum. Transition. From these early foundations and daily customs, Rome would grow into something unprecedented in human history. In our next segment, we'll explore how this city-state began its transformation into a Mediterranean superpower, starting with the wars that would define its character and test its resolve. Set 2. Rome's rise to power. Fact 11. The devastating Punic Wars against Carthage. The Punic Wars against Carthage were the bloodiest conflicts of the ancient world, with the Second Punic War alone claiming an estimated 400,000 Roman lives, about 1 in 5 adult male citizens. Carthage, located in modern-day Tunisia, was Rome's greatest rival for control of the Mediterranean. The conflict began in 264 BCE over control of Sicily and would rage on and off for over a century. The Second Punic War brought Rome to the brink of annihilation when the brilliant Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca crossed the Alps with war elephants and devastated Italy for 16 years. At the Battle of Cannae in 216 BCE, Hannibal achieved what military historians consider the most perfect tactical victory in history, encircling and annihilating a Roman army of 80,000 men in a single afternoon. Rome lost so many soldiers that they resorted to arming slaves and criminals. Yet, somehow, the Romans refused to surrender, and their determination would ultimately lead to Carthage's complete destruction. Fact 12. The complete destruction of Carthage after finally defeating Hannibal. Rome became so paranoid about Carthage that they completely destroyed the city in 146 BCE, allegedly sowing the fields with salt so nothing could ever grow there again. The Third Punic War was less a war than an execution. Despite Carthage no longer posing a real threat, the Roman senator Cato the Elder ended every speech, no matter the topic, with the phrase Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. When Rome finally attacked, they besieged the city for 3 years. When the walls were finally breached, the Romans fought house to house for 6 days. The 50,000 surviving Carthaginians were sold into slavery, the city was burned for 17 days straight, and according to legend, the Romans plowed the ruins and cursed the ground. While modern historians debate whether salt was actually used, the psychological effect was real. Carthage, once Rome's greatest rival, was erased so thoroughly that its exact location was lost for centuries. Fact 13. Roman. Soldiers being paid in salt, origin of salary. Roman soldiers weren't paid in money initially, they were paid in salt, which is where we get the word salary from the Latin word salarium. Salt was extraordinarily valuable in the ancient world because it was the primary method of preserving food before refrigeration. A soldier's salt ration wasn't just payment, it was essential for survival, allowing them to preserve meat during long campaigns. The Romans controlled major salt, production sites and trade routes, understanding that whoever controlled the salt controlled the food supply. This is also why we have the expression, worth your salt. It literally meant you were worth the salary paid to you. Roman soldiers would also receive a grain ration, and later, as the empire grew wealthier, actual monetary payments in silver denarii. But the connection between salt and salary persisted in language long after the practice ended, a linguistic fossil from Rome's early military days. Fact 14. Julius Caesar's kidnapping by pirates. Julius Caesar was kidnapped by pirates as a young man, and when they demanded a ransom of 20 talents of silver, he was insulted and insisted they ask for 50 instead. This incident, which occurred in 75 BCE when Caesar was just 25 years old, perfectly captures his audacious personality. While held captive for 38 days, Caesar treated the pirates with bemused contempt. He told them he would crucify them all once he was free. They laughed, thinking it was a joke. Caesar wrote poetry and speeches, which he would recite to his captors, and when they didn't appreciate his work, he called them illiterate barbarians to their faces. He exercised regularly, participated in their games, and generally acted as if he were the one in charge. Once his ransom was paid and he was released, Caesar immediately assembled a naval force, hunted down the pirates, recovered his ransom money, and crucified every single one of them, though he did show mercy by having their throats cut first to speed their deaths. It was an early demonstration of the determination and ruthlessness that would later make him master of Rome. Fact 15. How the Roman Senate voted by physically moving. The Roman Senate had 600 members at its peak, but they didn't actually vote on most matters. They voted with their feet by physically moving to stand near the senator whose proposal they supported. This physical voting method was called division of the House. When a proposal was made, senators would literally walk to one side of the Senate chamber or the other, or gather around the proposing senator to show support. The method made vote counting simple. You could see at a glance which side had more support, and it made political allegiances highly visible. There was no secret ballot and no privacy in your political choices. This public accountability meant that senators had to be prepared to defend their positions openly. The Senate met in various locations throughout Rome's history, but most famously in the Curia Julia, a building begun by Julius Caesar and completed by Augustus. The Senate wielded enormous power in the Republic, controlling finances, foreign policy, and military commands, though technically they could only advise magistrates rather than directly govern. Fact 16. The origins of gladiatorial games as funeral rites. Gladiatorial games weren't just brutal entertainment, they originated as funeral rites, with slaves and prisoners forced to fight to the death to honor deceased aristocrats. The first recorded gladiatorial combat in Rome took place in 264 BCE, when the sons of a nobleman named Junius Brutus Pyrrha staged fights between 3 pairs of slaves at their father's funeral. The belief was that blood spilled in combat would appease the spirits of the dead and provide them with warrior servants in the afterlife. Over time, these funeral games became increasingly elaborate spectacles, with politicians using them to win public favor. By the imperial period, gladiatorial games had evolved into massive state-sponsored entertainment at venues like the Colosseum, which could hold 50,000 spectators. While we imagine all gladiators fought to the death, the reality was more complex. Trained gladiators were expensive investments, and many fights ended when one fighter was wounded or yielded. The games were finally banned in 404 CE by the Christian emperor Honorius, though beast hunts continued for another century. Fact 17. Naval battles in the flooded Colosseum. The Colosseum could be flooded with water for mock naval battles called naumachiae, complete with full-sized ships and hundreds of condemned prisoners fighting to the death. These elaborate aquatic spectacles were among the most expensive and impressive forms of entertainment in Rome. Engineers would seal the arena floor and fill it with enough water to float ships, sometimes reenacting famous historical naval battles like the conflict between Athens and Syracuse, or Romans versus Carthaginians. The condemned prisoners, often war captives or criminals sentenced to death, would be divided into opposing forces, given weapons, and forced to fight an actual naval battle while tens of thousands watched from the stands. The splashing oars, the shouting of commands, the clash of boarding parties. It was warfare as theatre. The logistics were staggering. Managing the water, supply, training prisoners in basic seamanship, building ships that could be disassembled and stored, and then draining and cleaning the arena afterward. Later emperors built permanent artificial lakes for even larger naval spectacles, but flooding. The Colosseum itself remained the ultimate display of imperial power over nature. Fact 18. Romans using urine as mouthwash. Romans used urine as mouthwash and tooth whitener, and it actually worked because of the ammonia content. As strange as it sounds to modern ears, this was common practice throughout the Roman Empire. Urine, particularly aged or fermented urine, contains ammonia, which is an effective cleaning agent and bleaching substance. Romans would collect urine in large pots, placed on street corners. There was even a tax on urine collection because it was so valuable for various industrial processes. Besides dental hygiene, urine was essential for the clothing industry, used to clean and soften wool and to set dyes in fabric. The fuller's trade, which involved treading on cloth soaked in urine, was a major industry. The Emperor Vespasian famously defended the urine tax when his son complained about its undignified nature, holding up a gold coin and saying, "Pecunia non olet," money doesn't smell. This practical Roman attitude toward bodily functions strikes us as crude today, but it reflected a pragmatic, waste not, want not approach to natural resources. 19. The true details of Caesar's assassination, the assassination of Julius Caesar on the Ides of March in 44 BCE, involved 60 conspirators, but only about 23 of them actually stabbed him, and he died from the second stab wound rather than the famous 23 wounds often cited. Shakespeare immortalized Caesar's assassination, but the historical reality was even more dramatic than the play. The conspirators, led by Marcus Brutus and Gaius Cassius, lured Caesar to a Senate meeting at the theatre of Pompey. When Caesar took his seat, the conspirators surrounded him under the pretense of presenting a petition, and grabbed his toga, the signal to strike, and the daggers came out. Caesar fought back initially, but according to the physician's examination, the second wound, which pierced his chest, was the fatal blow. The assassins struck so many blows that they wounded each other in the frenzy. When Caesar saw his close friend Brutus among the attackers, he allegedly said, "Kai su teknon," "You too, child," in Greek, not the Latin et tu, brute. He then pulled his toga over his head to die with dignity. The conspirators believed they were saving the Republic from tyranny, but instead they triggered a civil war that would end the Republic forever. In fact, 20. Augustus's rise to power after displaying Caesar's bloody toga. After Caesar's assassination, his heir Octavian, later Emperor Augustus, displayed Caesar's blood-soaked toga in the Forum, turning public opinion against the assassins and starting a civil war. This was political theater at its most visceral. Mark Antony, Caesar's right-hand man, gave a masterful funeral oration that whipped the crowd into a frenzy, but it was the visual evidence that sealed the assassin's fate. The toga, with its 23 stab holes, was hung on a tall frame in the Forum where everyone could see it. The Roman people, who had loved Caesar despite the Senate's fears about his power, were horrified. Riots broke out immediately. The assassins' houses were attacked and burned. Brutus and Cassius had to flee the city for their lives. What followed was more than a decade of civil war between Caesar's supporters and his assassins, and then between his supporters themselves. Octavian, Caesar's 18-year-old adopted son, proved to be a brilliant political operator. He formed an alliance with Mark Antony and Marcus Lepidus, hunted down the assassins, and eventually turned on Antony himself. By 27 BCE, Octavian stood supreme, and the Senate granted him the title Augustus. The Roman Republic was dead. The Roman Empire had begun. Transition 20. With Augustus's rise, Rome entered a new era, one of unprecedented peace and prosperity. But the transition from republic to empire would fundamentally change every aspect of Roman society. From how emperors claimed power to how ordinary people lived their daily lives. In our next segment, we'll explore the Age of the Emperors. Set 3. The Age of Emperors, Fact 21. Augustus's paranoia about assassination. Augustus, Rome's first emperor, was so paranoid about assassination that he never held private meetings, always wore a breastplate under his toga during Senate sessions, and kept his bedroom door guarded by soldiers every night. Given that he'd watched his adoptive father Julius Caesar get stabbed 23 times by senators, his paranoia was arguably justified. Augustus slept with a sword under his pillow and refused to read letters unless someone else had checked them first. He created the Praetorian Guard, an elite unit of 9,000 soldiers whose sole purpose was protecting the emperor, though this would backfire spectacularly when future Praetorian Guards assassinated emperors they didn't like and even auctioned the imperial throne to the highest bidder. Despite his fears, Augustus died peacefully in his bed at age 75 after ruling for 41 years, having transformed Rome from a war-torn republic into a stable empire. His last words, delivered with characteristic theatrical flair, were reportedly, "Have I played the part well? Then applaud as I exit," treating his entire reign as a performance for the Roman people. Fact 22. The 200-year Pax Romana, Roman peace. The Pax Romana, or Roman peace, lasted approximately 200 years from 27 BCE to 180 CE, and was the longest period of relative peace and stability in European history until modern times. This doesn't mean there were no wars. Rome was constantly fighting on its frontiers. But there were no major civil wars, and the Mediterranean interior enjoyed unprecedented security and prosperity. Trade flourished across 3 continents. Cities grew and thrived without needing defensive walls. A merchant could travel from Britain to Egypt with a single currency, under a single legal system, speaking Latin or Greek anywhere along the way. Pirates were eliminated from the seas, and bandits were suppressed on the roads. The population of the empire reached an estimated 70 million people, about 20% of the world's population at the time. This stability allowed for remarkable cultural and technological advancement. The Pax Romana is often held up as a golden age, though it's worth noting that this peace was built on the brutal conquest and exploitation of millions, and was maintained by the ever-present threat of Roman military might. Fact 23. Emperor Caligula and his horse Incitatus. Emperor Caligula, famous for his insanity, allegedly planned to make his favorite horse Incitatus a consul and housed the animal in a marble stable with an ivory manger, purple blankets, and a collar of precious stones. Caligula's reign, lasting only 4 years from 37 to 41 CE, became legendary for bizarre cruelty and apparent madness. Ancient historians claim he ordered his soldiers to collect seashells from a beach as spoils of war against Neptune, demanded to be worshipped as a living god, and engaged in incest with his sisters. The story about making Incitatus a consul might have been exaggerated or misunderstood. Some modern historians suggest Caligula was sarcastically mocking the Senate by implying his horse could do their job just as well. Whether genuinely insane or deliberately provocative, Caligula's behavior terrified Rome's elite. After he threatened to move the capital to Egypt, and reportedly said he wished all Romans had a single neck so he could cut it, the Praetorian Guard assassinated him in an underground passage, stabbing him 30 times. His wife and infant daughter were also murdered to eliminate any potential heirs. In 24, Nero and the Great Fire of Rome. Emperor Nero didn't actually fiddle while Rome burned in 64 CE. The fiddle hadn't been invented yet, but he may have sung and played the lyre while watching parts of the city engulf in flames from a safe distance. The Great Fire of Rome burned for 6 days, destroying 3 of Rome's 14 districts completely and severely damaging 7 others. Tens of thousands were left homeless. Nero was actually at his villa in Antium, 35 miles away, when the fire started and rushed back to organize relief efforts, opening his palaces to shelter refugees and arranging food supplies. However, rumors immediately spread that Nero had started the fire to clear space for his massive new palace complex, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House. Whether true or not, Nero needed a scapegoat. He blamed the Christians, a small, unpopular religious sect, and launched the first imperial persecution of Christianity, having Christians burned alive as human torches to light his gardens at night. The fire and Nero's response marked a turning point in Roman history, accelerating his decline in popularity and setting a precedent for Christian persecution that would continue for centuries. Fact 25. The dangerous life of Roman emperors. Roman emperors held absolute power, but had an average reign of just 7 years, and nearly 70% of emperors died violently, assassinated, executed, killed in battle, or forced to commit suicide. Being emperor was one of the most dangerous jobs in history. Of the approximately 70 emperors who ruled between Augustus and the fall of the Western Empire, fewer than 20 died peacefully of natural causes or illness. The year of the 4 emperors, in 69 CE, saw 4 different men claim the throne, with 3 dying violently within months. The year of the 5 emperors in 193 CE was even worse, with the Praetorian Guard literally auctioning the empire to a wealthy senator named Didius Julianus, who was executed just 66 days later. Emperors faced threats from the Senate, the army, their own bodyguards, rival claimants, and even their own family members. Emperor Commodus survived multiple assassination attempts, including one by his own sister, before finally being strangled in his bath. The constant threat of violent death created a paranoid, brutal atmosphere at the top of Roman society that shaped imperial policies and behavior. Fact 26. The vast size of the Roman Empire at its peak. The Roman Empire was so vast at its peak in 117 CE under Emperor Trajan that it controlled approximately 2.3 million square miles, about 2/3 the size of the continental United States, and stretched from Scotland to the Sahara Desert, from Portugal to the Persian Gulf. Managing this enormous territory was a staggering administrative achievement. The empire encompassed wildly diverse climates, cultures, and peoples: Celtic tribes in Britain, Greek city-states in the east, Egyptian farmers along the Nile, Germanic peoples beyond the Rhine, and Berber kingdoms in North Africa. Rome maintained control through a combination of military might, administrative efficiency, and cultural assimilation. The empire was divided into provinces, each governed by officials appointed from Rome. A complex system of taxation funded the military and public works. The famous Roman roads connected even the most remote provinces to the capital, allowing armies to move quickly and information to flow. At this peak, roughly 1 in every 5 humans on Earth lived under Roman rule, speaking hundreds of languages, but united by Roman law, protected by Roman legions, and paying taxes to Rome. Fact 27. Roman apartment buildings, insulae. Romans invented apartment buildings called insulae that could rise up to 9 stories high, making Rome a vertical city where the poor lived in dangerous upper floors, while the wealthy occupied ground-level homes with private courtyards. Ancient Rome's population swelled to over 1 million inhabitants, creating a severe housing crisis. Most Romans couldn't afford private homes, so they lived in these multi-story apartment blocks. The higher the floor, the cheaper the rent, and the more dangerous. Upper floors were notoriously prone to collapse and fire because they were poorly constructed using cheap wood and didn't have running water or heating. Residents used chamber pots and braziers for heat, creating constant fire hazards. Ground floor apartments were far superior, with some even having running water from the aqueducts. The wealthy, meanwhile, lived in spacious single-family homes called domus, with their own courtyards, gardens, and even libraries. The contrast between rich and poor was literally vertical. You could judge someone's wealth by how many stairs they had to climb. The satirist Juvenal complained about the noise, crime, and falling debris in Rome's overcrowded streets, painting a picture of urban chaos that sounds remarkably modern. Fact 28. Ancient Roman fast food culture, thermopolia. Ancient Romans had a 24/7 fast food culture, with over 200 thermopolia, ancient fast food restaurants, operating in Pompeii alone, serving hot food and drinks to customers who often didn't have kitchens in their apartments. These establishments were the ancient equivalent of modern takeout restaurants. They featured long marble counters with large pottery jars built into them, keeping food hot and ready to serve. Menus included items like spelt and chickpea soups, fish, baked cheese, lentils, and various meats. Many thermopolia also served wine mixed with water and spices. The famous thermopolium discovered in Pompeii still had food in its jars when excavated, including duck, goat, pig, fish, and snail remains. These weren't fancy establishments. They catered to working-class Romans who lived in apartments without cooking facilities and couldn't afford to dine at home. Some thermopolia had a few chairs or a small room in back for eating, but most customers grabbed food and ate standing or took it away. This fast food culture reveals that ancient Romans lived surprisingly urban, busy lives, grabbing quick meals between work and social obligations, much like modern city dwellers do today. Fact 29. Social public toilets with no privacy. Public toilets in ancient Rome were social spaces where Romans would sit side by side on long benches with holes, chatting casually about politics and daily life, while doing their business with no privacy whatsoever. Roman public latrines, often attached to bathhouses, featured long stone or marble benches with keyhole-shaped openings placed shoulder to shoulder. Underneath, a channel of constantly flowing water carried waste away to the sewers. In front of the seats, a second channel of clean water ran where users could rinse the communal sponge on a stick that Romans used instead of toilet paper. There were no dividers, no doors, no privacy, just rows of Romans sitting together, completely comfortable with this communal arrangement. Some latrines were quite luxurious, with decorated walls and mosaic floors. Romans didn't share our modern embarrassment about bodily functions. These toilets were considered such pleasant social spaces that people would gather there just to chat, even when they didn't need to use the facilities. This openness extended to their famous bathhouses, where Romans of all social classes would bathe naked together, conduct business, exercise, and socialize for hours each day. Fact 30. The Colosseum's retractable awning, operated by sailors. The Roman Colosseum, properly called the Flavian Amphitheatre, had a retractable awning system operated by sailors from the Roman Navy, who were stationed in Rome specifically to manage this massive piece of naval engineering on dry land. The velorium was one of the most impressive engineering features of the Colosseum. This enormous canvas awning could be deployed to shade spectators from the intense Mediterranean sun. It was supported by 240 wooden masts, positioned around the top of the arena, and required a crew of about 1,000 sailors to operate, using their expertise with ropes, rigging, and large-scale fabric management. The sailors lived in a nearby barracks and were specially assigned to this duty. They could deploy or retract the velorium in response to changing weather conditions, tilting it at different angles to provide optimal shade throughout the day. The system was so sophisticated that it could cover 2/3 of the arena while leaving the center open for ventilation. This naval technology applied to architecture perfectly symbolizes Roman engineering innovation. They took expertise from one domain and brilliantly adapted it to solve problems in another, creating solutions that wouldn't be matched for over 1,000 years. Transition 30. The engineering marvels of Rome extended far beyond entertainment venues. From water management to urban planning, Roman innovation touched every aspect of daily life and left a legacy that modern civilization still builds upon. In our next segment, we'll dive into the incredible infrastructure that made Roman urban life possible. Set 4. Engineering and infrastructure. Fact 31. Rome's massive aqueduct system delivering 300 million gallons daily. Rome's aqueduct system delivered nearly 300 million gallons of fresh water to the city every single day. More water per capita than many modern cities provide today. By the 3rd century CE, 11 major aqueducts fed Rome, some stretching over 50 miles from mountain sources. The most impressive was the Aqua Marcia, built in 144 BCE, which traveled 57 miles and delivered the coldest, purest water to the city. What made Roman aqueducts revolutionary wasn't just their scale, but their precision. Engineers had to maintain a consistent downward gradient of just 1 foot per every 300 feet of length to keep water flowing at the right speed. Too steep and the water would erode the channels. Too shallow and it would stagnate. Most of an aqueduct ran underground, or at ground level, with the famous arched sections only needed when crossing valleys. The Pont de Gare in France, standing 160 feet tall with 3 tiers of arches, carried water across a valley and still stands today as a testament to Roman engineering. This abundant water supply made possible Rome's famous public baths, fountains, public toilets, and even private household plumbing for the wealthy. Fact 32. The Vigiles, Rome's first public fire department. The Romans invented the first public fire department, the Vigiles, consisting of 7,000 men organized into military-style units who patrolled Rome's streets at night, fighting fires and catching criminals. Before the Vigiles were established by Emperor Augustus in 6th CE, Rome's fire protection was handled by private fire brigades run by the notorious Marcus Licinius Crassus, who would show up at burning buildings, refuse to put out the fire until the owner sold him the property at a fraction of its value, and then save the building. Augustus ended this corruption by creating a professional, publicly funded force. The Vigiles were organized into 7 cohorts of 1,000 men each, with each cohort responsible for 2 of Rome's 14 districts. They patrolled at night with buckets, axes, pumps, and wet blankets, and had the authority to enter any building they suspected might be a fire hazard. They also served as a night watch, arresting thieves and maintaining order after dark. Members served for 6 years and received Roman citizenship upon discharge, a significant benefit that made the position attractive to freed slaves and non-citizens. The Vigiles represented one of the first organized emergency services in history. Fact 33. The hypocaust underfloor heating system. Roman bathhouses were heated using an ingenious system called the hypocaust, which circulated hot air from a furnace beneath raised floors and through hollow walls, essentially inventing underfloor heating nearly 2,000 years before modern radiant heating systems. The hypocaust was one of Rome's most brilliant engineering innovations. A furnace, usually fired by wood or charcoal, heated air that flowed into a space beneath the floor which was raised about 3 feet on small pillars called pili stacks. The hot air circulated under the entire floor before rising through hollow tiles embedded in the walls and escaping through vents in the roof. This created even comfortable heat throughout large spaces. The system was so efficient that bathhouses could maintain different temperature rooms: the frigidarium, cold room, tepidarium, warm room, and caldarium, hot room, all within the same complex. Wealthy Romans also installed hypocaust systems in their private homes. The technology required sophisticated understanding of thermodynamics, airflow, and construction techniques. Some Roman hypocaust systems were so well built that they operated continuously for decades without major repairs. After Rome fell, this technology was largely lost in Western Europe and wouldn't be rediscovered until the modern era. Fact 34. The Cloaca Maxima sewer system, still in use after 2,600 years. The Cloaca Maxima, Rome's great sewer system begun in the 6th century BCE, is still in use today, making it one of the world's oldest continuously operating sewer systems at over 2,600 years old. Initially built as an open-air canal to drain the marshy valleys between Rome's hills, the Cloaca Maxima was eventually covered over and expanded into an elaborate underground network. At its heart was a massive tunnel, in some places large enough to drive a hay wagon through, lined with stones so precisely fitted they needed no mortar. The system collected waste from public toilets, bathhouses, and streets, carrying it directly into the Tiber River. While this solved Rome's immediate sanitation problems, it did make the Tiber notoriously polluted. The Romans didn't understand disease transmission through water, so they saw no problem with dumping sewage into the same river they drew water from downstream, though they were careful to position their aqueduct intakes far upstream from the city. The engineering of the Cloaca Maxima was so sound that sections of it still function as part of Rome's modern sewer system. You can even tour parts of it today, walking through tunnels that have carried Rome's waste for over 2 millennia. Fact 35. The first vending machine invented in the 1st century. See, Roman engineers invented the first vending machine in the 1st century CE. a device that dispensed holy water in temples when you inserted a coin. This ingenious machine was invented by Hero of Alexandria, a Greek engineer working in Roman Egypt. When a coin was dropped into a slot on top of the machine, it fell onto one end of a lever. The weight of the coin tipped the lever, which opened a valve that released a small amount of holy water. When the coin slipped off the lever into a collection box, the valve closed automatically, stopping the water flow. The machine was installed in Egyptian temples to prevent priests from having to constantly dispense holy water and to stop people from taking more than their fair share. While it seems like a simple novelty, this device demonstrated sophisticated understanding of mechanics, hydraulics, and automation. Hero of Alexandria was far ahead of his time, also inventing the aeolipile, a primitive steam engine, automated theatre props, and programmable machines. Most of his inventions were treated as curiosities rather than practical tools, and the knowledge was largely lost after the fall of Rome. Vending machines wouldn't be reinvented until the 1880s, nearly 1,800 years later. Fact 36. The Pantheon's unreinforced concrete dome. The Pantheon in Rome has the world's largest unreinforced concrete dome, completed in 128 CE, and for Quantirai 300 in years it was the largest dome of any kind in the world, not surpassed until the Florence Cathedral was finished in 1436. Even more remarkably, the Pantheon's dome remains the largest unreinforced concrete dome ever built. The engineering is breathtaking. The dome is a perfect hemisphere with a diameter of 142 feet, exactly equal to the interior height of the building, creating a perfect sphere if you could complete it below the floor. To prevent the massive weight from collapsing, Roman engineers used different concrete mixtures, with heavier stone aggregates in the base and progressively lighter materials toward the top, culminating in pumice stone near the oculus, the 27-foot opening at the dome's peak. The oculus serves as the building's only light source, creating a dramatic moving spotlight as the sun travels across the sky. The floor has subtle drains to handle rain that falls through the opening. The building has survived nearly 2,000 years of earthquakes, floods, and wars with minimal damage. When Michelangelo first saw it, he reportedly said it looked more like the work of angels than humans. The Pantheon stands as perhaps the greatest architectural achievement of ancient Rome. Fact 37. Romans systems. Extensive use of lead in plumbing. Romans used lead pipes extensively in their plumbing systems, and some historians believe chronic lead poisoning among the elite contributed to the empire's decline, though this theory remains hotly debated. The Latin word for lead is plumbum, which gives us our modern words plumbing and plumber. Romans used lead for water pipes, cooking pots, wine storage containers, and even as a sweetener in food and drink. Lead acetate, called sugar of lead, was deliberately added to cheap wine to mask sour tastes. The wealthy were most at risk because they could afford lead pipes and lead-lined cooking vessels. Modern analysis of Roman bones and water systems confirms significant lead exposure, especially among the upper classes. Symptoms of chronic lead poisoning include cognitive impairment, irritability, reduced fertility, and erratic behavior, traits that some historians argue characterized Rome's later emperors. However, many modern historians dispute lead as a major factor in Rome's decline, pointing out that calcium carbonate deposits would have quickly coated the inside of lead pipes, preventing direct water contact with lead. The debate continues, but it's clear that Romans were exposed to dangerous levels of lead, even if the exact impact on the empire's fate remains uncertain. Fact 38. Trajan's Market, the world's first shopping mall. The Romans built the world's first shopping mall, Trajan's Market, a massive multi-story commercial complex completed in 113 CE that housed over 150 shops and offices, complete with administrative spaces and even an ancient food court. Built into the slope of the Quirinal Hill in Rome, Trajan's Market was an architectural marvel that functioned remarkably like a modern shopping center. The complex had multiple levels connected by staircases, with different floors dedicated to different types of goods. The lower levels sold fresh fruits, vegetables, and fish. The middle levels housed shops selling wine, oil, and other goods. The upper levels contained offices for imperial administration and welfare distribution. The market had a main hall, the Via Biberatica, that functioned as a covered street where shoppers could browse under shelter. Each shop was a small room opening onto this corridor, creating the world's first storefront retail experience. The complex even had a main administrative building, the Torre del Milizie, which served as a command center for the market's operations. Unlike the Forum, which was primarily a civic and religious space where commerce happened incidentally, Trajan's market was purpose-built for shopping and business, making it the true ancestor of modern malls. The structure still stands today, now serving as a museum. Fact 39. The Cursus Publicus postal system. Ancient Rome had a sophisticated postal system called the Cursus Publicus that could deliver messages across the entire empire at an average speed of 50 miles per day, using a network of relay stations with fresh horses and riders. Established by Emperor Augustus around 20 BCE, this was the Roman equivalent of the Pony Express, but operating across 3 continents. The system used a network of way stations called mutationes, where horses were changed, and mansiones, where riders could rest overnight, positioned every 5 to 12 miles along major roads. Urgent imperial messages could travel even faster, primed to 170 miles per day, using lightweight riders and the best horses changing at every station. The service was strictly controlled and limited to official government business. Unauthorized use could result in severe punishment. Couriers carried special permits called diplomata that allowed them to requisition fresh horses and supplies. This system was so efficient that an emperor in Rome could communicate with governors in Spain or Syria and receive replies within weeks rather than in months. The Cursus Publicus remained operational throughout the empire's existence and was so effective that similar systems wouldn't appear in Europe again until the late medieval period. It gave Rome an enormous advantage in coordinating military campaigns, collecting intelligence, and governing its vast territories. Fact 40. Heated bathhouses at Hadrian's Wall on the frontier. Roman engineers built heated floors in military bathhouses along Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain, bringing Mediterranean luxury to one of the empire's coldest, most remote frontiers. Hadrian's Wall, built starting in 122 CE, stretched 73 miles across northern England to keep out the unconquered Scottish tribes. Life for Roman soldiers stationed there was harsh, cold, wet, and isolated at the edge of the known world. Yet, archaeological excavations reveal that these frontier forts contained surprisingly sophisticated amenities. Multiple bathhouses with hypocaust heating systems have been discovered, some quite elaborate with the full sequence of heated rooms found in Rome itself. Soldiers stationed in places like Vindolanda and Chesters could finish a cold day of patrol duty and relax in a warm bath, just like their counterparts in Italy. The forts also had latrines with running water, centralized heating in some buildings, and well-organized layouts. This wasn't just about comfort, it was strategic. Good facilities improved morale, reduced disease, and helped retain troops in these difficult postings. The presence of such infrastructure at the empire's remote frontier demonstrates Rome's commitment to maintaining Roman civilization and standards even thousands of miles from the capital. These heated bathhouses symbolize Rome's greatest strength, the ability to project not just military power but an entire civilization and way of life to the edges of the known world. Transition 40. While Roman engineering shaped the physical world, Roman culture and entertainment captivated the hearts and minds of millions. From theatrical performances to religious festivals, from literary achievements to artistic innovations, Rome's cultural legacy rivals even its architectural one. In our next segment, we'll explore the vibrant cultural life that defined the Roman experience. Set 5. Culture and Entertainment. Fact 41. Roman theaters with sophisticated special effects. Roman theaters could seat up to 20,000 spectators and featured sophisticated special effects including trapdoors, flying actors suspended by cranes, and even artificial rain and thunder created by machines backstage. Roman theatrical productions were spectacular affairs that combined drama with technological wizardry. The stage machinery, called machinae, was incredibly complex. Actors could appear to fly through the air using cranes called pegma, descend from the heavens on platforms to play gods. This is where we get the phrase deus ex machina, meaning God from the machine. Trapdoors allowed actors and props to suddenly appear or disappear. Sound effects teams created thunder by rolling stones down copper tubes, and lightning effects used reflective metal sheets. Some theaters even had curtains that dropped into slots in the floor rather than rising, creating dramatic reveals. Unlike Greek theaters built into hillsides, Roman theaters were freestanding structures with elaborate facades and architectural elements. The Theatre of Pompey in Rome, completed in 55 BCE, was the first permanent stone theatre in the city and could hold 20,000 people. Admission was free, paid for by wealthy politicians seeking popularity, and performances would run all day with various plays, musical acts, and entertainment filling the hours. Fact 42. Religious festivals, ludi comprising 182 days of the year. Romans held massive religious festivals called ludi that could last for weeks, featuring games, theatrical, performances, and feasts, with up to 182 days of the Roman year designated as public holidays by the height of the empire. The Romans took their holidays seriously. What started as occasional religious festivals evolved into an extensive calendar of celebrations. The Ludi Romani, honoring Jupiter, lasted 16 days. The Saturnalia, celebrating the god Saturn, was a week-long December festival where social norms were inverted. Slaves dined with masters, people exchanged gifts, and gambling was permitted. During these festivals, businesses closed, courts didn't meet, and even warfare was suspended when possible. The games included chariot races, gladiatorial combats, theatrical performances, and wild beast hunts. Free food was often distributed to citizens. Emperors used these festivals to maintain popularity, with later emperors adding more and more holidays until nearly half the year was officially non-working days. This wasn't pure generosity, it was social control. The phrase bread and circuses comes from the Roman satirist Juvenal, who criticized how emperors kept the masses docile with free grain and entertainment rather than addressing real problems. But for ordinary Romans, these festivals provided genuine breaks from hard labor and opportunities for community celebration. Fact 43. Chariot racing and celebrity racer Diocles, who earned billions chariot racing, was Rome's most popular sport by far, more popular even than gladiatorial games, with successful charioteers becoming millionaire celebrities. One famous racer named Diocles earned 35 million sesterces in his career, equivalent to billions in modern currency. The Circus Maximus could hold up to 250,000 spectators, making it larger than any modern sports stadium. Chariot racing was organized around 4 teams, or factions, the blues, greens, reds, and whites, and Romans were fanatically devoted to their chosen faction. Riots between rival fan groups were common, and sometimes deadly. The races were incredibly dangerous. Chariots were lightweight, 2-wheeled vehicles pulled by 4 horses racing 7 laps around the track at breakneck speeds. Drivers wrapped the reins around their bodies and carried knives to cut themselves free in crashes, which were frequent and often fatal. Despite the danger, successful charioteers like Gaius Appuleius Diocles became wealthy beyond imagination. Diocles raced for 24 years, competed in 4,257 races, and won 1,462 of them. He had fan clubs, sponsorship deals, and his face appeared on everything from pottery to mosaics. His funeral monument, still standing today, lists his career statistics in meticulous detail. In terms of pure popularity and earning potential, Roman chariot racers were the ancient equivalent of modern Formula One drivers or NFL quarterbacks. Fact 44. Roman graffiti culture revealed in Pompeii. The Romans invented graffiti culture. Excavations of Pompeii have revealed thousands of inscriptions on walls, including everything from political slogans to love declarations to crude jokes and insults remarkably similar to modern graffiti. Walking through ancient Pompeii is like reading the social media of 79 CE. Walls are covered with scratched or painted messages in Latin that reveal the authentic voices of ordinary Romans. We find election endorsements. The fruit dealers, together with Helvius Vestalis, unanimously urge the election of Marcus Hulconius. Priscus. Love notes. Successus, a weaver, loves the innkeeper's slave girl named Iris. She, however, does not love him. Still, he begs her to have pity on him. Insults. Epaphra is not good at ball games. Bathroom humor. Apollinaris, the doctor of the Emperor Titus, had a good crap here. Philosophical musings. I wonder, O wall, that you have not collapsed, having to bear the tedious scribblings of so many writers. There are even complaints about graffiti itself. These inscriptions show that Romans were just like us. They fell in love, got their hearts broken, supported political candidates, made crude jokes, and felt compelled to leave their mark on the world. The graffiti of Pompeii provides an unfiltered window into Aequi, Roman life that formal literature cannot match. Fact 45, the vomitorium myth debunked. Roman dinner parties among the elite featured professional vomitoriums, though contrary to popular belief, this wasn't a room for purging food, but rather the name for the wide entrance passages in amphitheaters that allowed crowds to quickly exit, literally vomiting out spectators. This is one of history's most persistent misconceptions. The myth that Romans regularly induced vomiting at feasts. To eat more is largely false and based on misunderstanding Latin terminology. While the famously decadent Emperor Vitellius was said to have used a feather to induce vomiting so he could continue eating, this was viewed as disgusting excess even, by Roman standards, not normal behavior. The actual architectural vomitoria were brilliant crowd management solutions in amphitheaters and theaters, allowing tens of thousands of people to enter and exit efficiently without dangerous crushing. However, Roman elite dining could be genuinely extreme. Banquets might feature dozens of courses over many hours, with exotic foods like dormice fattened in special jars, peacock brains, and flamingo tongues. The hosts competed to serve the most unusual and expensive dishes. Between courses, servants might provide rose-scented water for hand-washing and entertainment, including musicians, dancers, and poetry recitations. But the popular image of Romans gorging themselves, vomiting, and gorging again is mostly historical fiction, amplified by Hollywood and misunderstood Latin terms. Fact 46. Latin's evolution into Romance languages. Latin, the language of Rome, never truly died. It evolved into the Romance languages spoken by over 900 million people today, including Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian. Latin was the language of administration, law, religion, and education throughout the Western Roman Empire. Even after Rome fell in 476 CE, Latin remained the language of the Catholic Church, scholarship, and diplomacy for another 1,000 years. But spoken Latin was already changing during the empire. The classical Latin of Cicero and Caesar was different from the vulgar Latin spoken by common people across the provinces. As the empire fragmented and isolated regions developed independently, local variations became more pronounced. In Iberia, vulgar Latin became Spanish and Portuguese. In Gaul, it became French. In Italy, various dialects eventually unified into Italian. In Dacia, isolated by Slavic invasions, Latin evolved into Romanian. These languages retain Latin's basic structure and much of its vocabulary. About 80% of Spanish and Italian words have Latin roots. English, despite being Germanic, borrowed roughly 60% of its vocabulary from Latin, either directly or through French. When you say emperor, republic, senate, justice, military, or thousands of other words, you're speaking Latin. Medical, legal, and scientific terminology remains predominantly Latin even today. In a very real sense, Latin is the most successful language in history. It conquered death by transforming into multiple living languages. Fact 47. Roman women's legal rights and social freedom. Roman women had more legal rights and social freedom than women in most other ancient civilizations. Though they still couldn't vote or hold political office, they could own property, inherit wealth, run businesses, and even divorce their husbands. Roman women's status was complex and varied greatly by social class and time period. Elite women could be highly educated, managing vast estates and influencing politics through their husbands and sons. Wealthy women like Livia, wife of Augustus, wielded enormous power behind the scenes. Women could inherit property, in their own right, make wills, and conduct business transactions. They attended public events, dined with male guests, and moved freely in public, a stark contrast to Greek women who were largely confined to their homes. Divorce was relatively simple and could be initiated by either spouse. Some women became successful business owners. We have records of female doctors, midwives, shopkeepers, and even gladiators. However, women were always under the legal authority of a male guardian. First, their father, then their husband, or a designated male relative. They couldn't vote in assemblies, hold magistracies, or serve in the military. Working-class women had more practical freedom by necessity, working alongside men in shops and fields, but less legal protection. Despite limitations, Roman women had significantly more autonomy than their counterparts in many other ancient societies, and some historians argue they wouldn't see comparable rights again in Europe until the modern, Fact 48, Roman obsession with omens and augury. Romans were obsessed with omens and augury, employing official priests called augurs, who interpreted the will of the gods by studying bird flight patterns, lightning strikes, and the entrails, if sacrificed animals, before making any important decision. No military campaign, political appointment, or major construction project would begin without consulting the augurs. These priests would mark out a section of sky, observe the flight, patterns of birds, their species, direction, speed, and behavior, and interpret what the gods were communicating. Eagles were particularly significant as the bird of Jupiter, king of the gods. Lightning strikes were carefully recorded, with different meanings depending on which direction they came from. Before battles, priests called haruspices would sacrifice animals and examine their livers, believing the organ's color, texture, and any abnormalities revealed divine messages. This wasn't superstition in Roman eyes, it was science. They kept meticulous records of omens and outcomes, building a database of correlations. If an action taken after a favorable omen succeeded, that interpretation was validated. The system was also conveniently flexible. If the omens were unfavorable, you could simply postpone the action and check again the next day. Skeptics like Cicero questioned the practice, but even skeptics participated because omens were so embedded in Roman political and religious culture that ignoring them was politically impossible and potentially treasonous. Fact 49. Julius Caesar's calendar reform creating a 445-day year. The Roman calendar was so inaccurate that by Julius Caesar's time, the seasons were occurring in the wrong months, prompting him to create the Julian calendar in 46 BCE. But the reform required making that year 445 days long to re-sync with the solar cycle. The original Roman calendar was a lunisolar calendar of only 355 days, requiring periodic adjustment months to be inserted to keep pace with the seasons. But the decision of when to add these months was controlled by priests and politicians who often manipulated the calendar for political purposes, extending their terms of office or shortening an opponent's. By the mid-1st century BCE, the calendar had drifted so far that harvest festivals were occurring in spring. Julius Caesar, advised by the Greek astronomer Sosigenes, implemented radical reform. He added 90 extra days to 46 BCE, creating the longest year in history, dubbed the Year of Confusion. The new Julian calendar had 365 days with a leap day every 4 years, closely approximating the solar year. He renamed the month Quintilis to July in his honor. The system was so successful that it remained in use for over 1,600 years. It was only replaced by the Gregorian calendar in 1582 because the Julian year was 11 minutes too long, causing a cumulative drift. Most of the world still uses a slightly modified version of Caesar's calendar. His reform affects how we measure time to this very day. Fact 50. Ancient Rome's celebrity culture with gladiator fan clubs. Romans created the first celebrity culture with famous gladiators, actors, and charioteers having fan clubs, endorsement deals, and groupies. Graffiti in Pompeii includes messages from women declaring their love for specific gladiators by name. One famous piece of Pompeian graffiti reads, "Celadus, the Thracian makes all the girls sigh." Another, "Crescens, the net fighter, holds the hearts of all the girls." These weren't just anonymous fighters. They were celebrities with recognizable names, signature fighting styles, and devoted followings. Successful gladiators received prizes, cash bonuses, and sometimes their freedom. Their images appeared on pottery, lamps, and mosaics. Women of all social classes swooned over them despite their low social status as slaves or criminals. The phenomenon extended beyond gladiators. Actors, despite being considered morally questionable, had passionate fans. The charioteer Diocles we mentioned earlier was a household name across the empire. Even emperors weren't immune to the celebrity. In culture, Emperor Commodus embarrassed the Senate by performing as a gladiator in the arena, though he only fought carefully staged bouts where he was never in real danger. This celebrity worship created the same dynamics we see today. Parasocial relationships, fan rivalries, merchandise, and the elevation of entertainers to cultural icons. The Romans invented not just the concept of celebrities, but the entire infrastructure of fame that defines modern pop culture. Transition 50. From entertainment to everyday life, Roman culture was rich and complex. But Rome wasn't just defined by its triumphs and innovations. It was also shaped by its conflicts, both internal and external. In our next segment, we'll explore the military, might that both built and ultimately strained the empire. Set 6, Military Power and Warfare. Fact 51. The structure and tactical flexibility of Roman legions. Roman legion at full strength consisted of approximately 5,000 heavily armed infantry soldiers organized into smaller units with such precise discipline and tactical flexibility that they could adapt to virtually any battlefield situation. The legion was divided into 10 cohorts, each containing 6 centuries of about 80 men, despite the name century meaning 100. Each century was led by a centurion, career soldiers who were the backbone of Roman military power. The legion's genius was its modular structure. Cohorts could fight independently or combine into larger formations. They could form the famous testudo or tortoise, formation with overlapping shields to protect against arrows, spread into loose skirmish lines, or create impenetrable defensive squares. Legionaries weren't just fighters. They were engineers, builders, and siege warfare specialists. They carried not only weapons and armor weighing about 60 pounds, but also tools for building fortifications, rations for several days, and personal items. Each soldier received extensive training in weapons, formations, and construction. They drilled constantly, practicing maneuvers until they became second nature. This combination of discipline, flexibility, and engineering skill made Roman legions the most effective military force in the ancient world for over 500 years. Fact 52. Professional soldiers. With 25-year terms and retirement benefits, Roman soldiers were paid professionals who signed up for 25-year terms, receiving regular wages, retirement bonuses, and land grants. This professional standing army was revolutionary and gave Rome and Idalia enormous advantage over armies of temporary conscripts. Before Rome, most ancient armies were composed of citizen soldiers who fought during campaign season and returned to their farms afterward. Rome's professional military changed everything. Soldiers enlisted for a quarter century, receiving standardized training, equipment, and 3 meals a day. They were paid in cash, initially 225 denarii per year, later increased by various emperors. After completing their service, veterans received either a substantial cash payment or a plot of land, often in newly conquered territories where they'd establish colonies and help Romanize the provinces. This system created a class of career soldiers whose loyalty was to their legion, and their general, not necessarily to Rome itself. A dynamic that would eventually contribute to civil wars, as generals used their devoted troops to seize power. But it also meant Roman armies were composed of experienced professional warriors who trained together for years, not farmers temporarily pressed into service. A Roman legionary in his 10th year of service was a hardened veteran who'd fought in multiple campaigns, built countless fortifications, and survived conditions that killed less disciplined troops. This professionalism was a key factor in Rome's military dominance. Fact 53. The brutal punishment of decimation. The Roman military punishment called decimation was so brutal that even Romans considered it extreme. When a unit showed cowardice or mutinied, every 10th soldier was randomly selected and beaten to death by his own comrades with clubs and stones. The word decimate literally means to remove 1/10, and that's exactly what this punishment did. The condemned men were selected by drawing lots, making it random and therefore particularly terrifying. You could be an exemplary soldier and still die because of your unit's collective failure. The remaining 9 soldiers in each group of had to carry out the execution themselves, creating shared guilt and trauma that bound the survivors together. Those who survived also faced additional punishment. They were forced to camp outside the fortifications, received barley instead of wheat in their rations, a humiliating downgrade, and suffered reduced pay. The practice was rare because commanders understood it destroyed morale and could trigger genuine mutiny. Julius Caesar never used it. Crassus famously decimated troops during the Spartacus slave revolt, and the historian Tacitus recorded instances during the civil wars. The punishment's severity reflects Roman military culture's obsession with discipline and collective responsibility. Individual courage meant nothing if unit cohesion failed. The mere threat of decimation helped maintain iron discipline in the ranks. Fact 54. Psychological warfare and siege tactics. Roman military tactics included psychological warfare like building massive siege towers and battering rams in full view of enemy cities, creating fear through engineering demonstrations days before actual attacks. Romans understood that breaking an enemy's will was as important as breaking their walls. When besieging a city, Roman engineers would construct enormous siege engines, towers up to 100 feet tall, battering rams weighing several tons, catapults capable of hurling 60-pound stones, while defenders watched helplessly from their walls. The message was clear: resistance was futile against Roman engineering prowess. Sometimes this display alone convinced cities to surrender without a fight. Romans also used terror tactics, like building a circumvallation wall around a besieged city, not just to contain defenders, but to show the besieged that escape was impossible. At the Siege of Alesia in 52 BCE, Julius Caesar's forces built 11 miles of fortifications in just 3 weeks, both encircling the Gallic defenders and protecting against relief forces. The Gauls watched this construction, seeing their hope of victory diminish with each completed section. Romans would also crucify captured defenders in sight of city walls, launch severed heads over walls using catapults, or parade captives to demoralize defenders. While these tactics seem cruel, they often resulted in bloodless surrenders, saving Roman lives. In Roman military thinking, winning without fighting was the ultimate victory. Fact 55. The gladius short sword and stabbing techniques. The Roman gladius short sword was specifically designed for close quarters stabbing in tight formation fighting, and legionaries were trained to thrust rather than slash. A single puncture wound to the abdomen was usually fatal and harder to defend against than slashing attacks. The gladius, typically 18 to 24 inches long, was the perfect weapon for Roman tactical doctrine. In the tight formations Romans used, there wasn't room for wild slashing. Instead, soldiers were drilled endlessly in controlled, economical thrusts. They'd hold their large rectangular shield, scutum, forward for protection, while delivering quick, lethal stabs over or around it. Roman training emphasized targeting specific areas: the throat, chest, abdomen, and groin. Stabbing created deep, penetrating wounds that were almost impossible to treat with ancient medicine and were less likely to be stopped by clothing or light armor than slashes. The Roman military writer Vegetius noted that a slash cut rarely kills, while a stab wound, though it penetrates but 2 inches, is generally fatal. Gladiators, by contrast, were trained to slash dramatically for entertainment value. Their fighting style was spectacle, not efficiency. The gladius was complemented by the pilum, a javelin designed to bend on impact so enemies couldn't throw it back. A legionary would throw his pilum to disrupt enemy formations, then close with the gladius for the kill. This combination of weapons, tactics, and relentless training made Roman soldiers devastatingly effective in close combat. Fact 56. Spartacus's slave rebellion. Spartacus, the slave who led the most famous rebellion against Rome in 73-71 BCE, started with just 70 escaped gladiators and grew his rebel army to over 120,000 escaped slaves who defeated multiple Roman legions before finally being crushed. Spartacus and his fellow gladiators escaped from a training school in Capua by seizing kitchen knives and fighting their way out. They took refuge on Mount Vesuvius, where escaped slaves and discontented farmers flocked to join them. What began as a desperate bid for freedom became a full-scale war. Spartacus proved to be a brilliant military tactician, repeatedly outmaneuvering and defeating Roman forces sent to capture him. His army looted Roman settlements, freed slaves, and armed themselves with captured weapons. The rebellion terrified Rome's elite. Here were the very people they'd enslaved rising up and defeating legions. For 2 years, Spartacus's forces ravaged southern Italy. Rome eventually sent 8 legions under Marcus Licinius Crassus, who defeated Spartacus in 71 BCE. Spartacus died in the final battle, fighting with legendary courage. Crassus captured 6,000 rebels and crucified them along the Appian Way from Rome to Capua, 1 crucified slave every 40 yards for 120 miles, as a warning to any who might consider rebellion. Spartacus became a legendary figure, symbolizing resistance against oppression, inspiring countless retellings from ancient times to modern films. Fact 57. Standardized military camp layouts. Roman military camps were so standardized that soldiers transferred between legions could navigate a new camp in complete darkness because every element, from gate positions to the commander's tent to the latrines, was always in exactly the same location. This standardization was brilliant military engineering. Every night on campaign, Roman legions built fortified camps called castra, following an identical layout. The camp was rectangular or square, surrounded by a ditch and earthwork wall topped, with a palisade of sharpened wooden stakes that each soldier carried. 4 gates, 1 on each side, connected via 2 main roads that intersected at the center where the commander's tent stood. Troops were organized by unit in predictable locations. The cavalry and auxiliaries camped near the gates for quick deployment. Workshops, hospitals, and supply areas occupied designated spaces. Latrines were always on the camp's periphery. This meant a soldier could be transferred from a legion in Britain to one in Syria and immediately know where everything was located. The system also ensured efficient construction. 10,000 men could build a complete fortified camp in just 3 hours, because everyone knew their exact role and location. Many of these temporary camps, built for just 1 or 2 nights, have been discovered by archaeologists, their outlines still visible nearly 2,000 years later. Some permanent fortresses evolved from these temporary camps, maintaining the same layout. Modern cities like Chester, York, and Cologne still reflect their Roman military origins in their street patterns. Fact 58. The disaster at Teutoburg, Forrestin 9. Rome suffered its worst military disaster at the Battle of Teutoburg Forest in 9 CE, when Germanic tribes ambushed and annihilated 3 entire legions, about 20,000 soldiers, in a massacre so traumatic that Rome never again attempted to conquer Germany. The disaster was orchestrated by Arminius, a Germanic chieftain who had served in the Roman army and understood their tactics. He feigned loyalty to the Roman commander Varus, while secretly organizing a coalition of Germanic tribes. Arminius, lured the Roman legions into the Teutoburg forest, claiming there was a rebellion to suppress. Over 3 days, Germanic warriors harried the column as it struggled through dense forest and marshland. The Romans couldn't form their usual battle formations in the terrain. Germanic attackers appeared from the trees, struck, and vanished. When Varus realized he'd been betrayed, he committed suicide. The legions were systematically destroyed. Archaeological excavations have uncovered thousands of artifacts and remains scattered across the battlefield, armor, weapons, coins, and bones, telling the story of a desperate running battle. When news reached Rome, Emperor Augustus allegedly wandered his palace for days, crying, "Quintilius Verus, give me back my legions." The legion numbers 17th, 17th, and 99 were never used again. Rome established the Rhine as its northern boundary and abandoned plans to conquer Germania. The psychological impact was profound. Mighty Rome had been humbled by barbarians, and the defeat haunted Roman consciousness for generations. Fact 59. Portable Roman field artillery. Roman military engineering included portable field artillery. They developed torsion-powered catapults and ballistae that could be disassembled, transported by legions on campaign, and quickly reassembled to provide devastating ranged firepower in sieges and battles. These weren't crude devices, they were precision instruments of war. The ballista resembled a giant crossbow, firing bolts with enough force to penetrate shields and armor or even multiple enemies in a line. Larger versions could hurl stones weighing 60 pounds or more. The onager, a type of catapult, could throw projectiles over 1,000 feet. These engines used torsion power, twisted bundles of sinew or hair that, when released, provided enormous energy. Roman engineers understood the mathematics of trajectory, angle, and range. They could adjust their engines to hit specific targets accurately. Legions carried these weapons, disassembled, and had specialized units trained in their assembly and operation. Contemporary accounts describe battles where Roman artillery suppressed enemy positions while infantry advanced, combining arms in sophisticated ways. During sieges, Romans would use artillery to destroy defensive walls, clear battlements of defenders, and create covering fire. The Dacian Wars under Emperor Trajan saw extensive use of field artillery, documented on Trajan's column in Rome. These weapons gave Roman armies capabilities that wouldn't be matched until the development of gunpowder artillery over 1,000 years later. Fact 60. The Praetorian Guard's corruption and eventual disbandment. The Praetorian Guard, established by Augustus as the emperor's elite bodyguard, eventually became so powerful and corrupt that they assassinated multiple emperors, auctioned the imperial throne to the highest bidder, and were finally disbanded in 312 CE, after backing the wrong side in a civil war. What began as Augustus's solution to the assassination problem became its own threat. The Praetorian Guard consisted of the empire's best soldiers, stationed in Rome itself, an unprecedented concentration of military power at the empire's political heart. They received higher pay than regular legionaries and shorter service terms, creating an elite force deeply invested in imperial politics. Over time, they realized their unique power. They could make or break emperors. In 41 CE, Praetorians assassinated Caligula and installed Claudius, who rewarded them generously. This set a dangerous precedent. In 193 CE, after assassinating Emperor Pertinax, the Praetorians literally auctioned the empire to the highest bidder. Senator Didius Julianus won with a promise of 25,000 sesterces per guard, only to be executed by Septimius Severus's legions 9 weeks later. Over 3 centuries, Praetorians were implicated in the assassination of at least a dozen emperors. Emperor Constantine finally disbanded the Guard in 312 CE after they supported his rival Maxentius in the Civil War. The Praetorian Guard exemplifies how institutions designed to protect power can ultimately threaten it when they develop their own interests and realize their king-making potential. Transition, 60 Mom. Military might built the empire, but maintaining it across vast distances and diverse peoples required more than just legions. Rome developed sophisticated systems of governance, law, and administration that would influence civilizations for millennia. In our next segment, we'll explore how Rome actually ruled its massive empire. Set 7. Governance, Law, and Administration. Fact 61. Roman law as the foundation of modern legal systems. Roman law, codified in the 12 tables around 450 BCE and later expanded into the comprehensive corpus juris civilis, forms the foundation of legal systems in most of Europe, Latin America, and parts of Asia, making it arguably the most influential legal framework in human history. The 12 tables were Rome's first written laws, publicly displayed in the Forum so all citizens could know their rights and obligations. This transparency was revolutionary. Previously, laws had been controlled by aristocratic priests who could interpret them arbitrarily. Over centuries, Roman law evolved through the work of jurists, incorporating concepts like innocent until proven guilty, the right to face one's accuser, and the burden of proof lying with the prosecution. The system distinguished between different types of law: civil law governing disputes between citizens, criminal law addressing offenses against the state, and public law dealing with government operations. Emperor Justinian's compilation in 529-534 CE, the Corpus Juris Civilis, synthesized 1,000 years of Roman legal thought into a comprehensive code that survived the empire's fall. When medieval European kingdoms began developing sophisticated legal systems, they turned to Roman law as their model. Modern concepts like contracts, property rights, torts, and legal personhood all derive from Roman jurisprudence. Today, civil law systems descended from Roman law govern over 150 countries, affecting billions of people who benefit from legal principles first articulated in ancient Rome. Fact 62. The comprehensive Roman census system, the Roman census, was far more than just counting people. It was a comprehensive survey of every citizen's property, wealth, and family status, conducted every 5 years and used to determine tax, obligations, military eligibility, and voting rights. Roman censors wielded enormous power, conducting house-to-house surveys throughout Italy and eventually across the empire. Citizens had to declare their property down to the last slave and farm animal under penalty of having their possessions confiscated or being sold into slavery themselves. The census categorized citizens into different classes based on wealth, which determined whether they served as cavalry, heavy infantry, or light troops in the military. It also affected voting rights. Rome's assemblies were organized by property class, with wealthier citizens' votes carrying more weight. Beyond practical administration, the census had moral dimensions. Censors could place a nota or mark of disgrace on citizens who behaved improperly, removing them from the Senate or their tribe. This gave censors moral authority over public behavior. The registration process could take months as censors traveled throughout Roman territory. Emperor Augustus famously used census data to claim there were 4,063,000 Roman citizens in 28 BCE. The census also served propaganda purposes, demonstrating Rome's administrative reach and organizational sophistication. Modern government census operations, tax systems, and demographic surveys all descend from Roman administrative innovations. Fact 63. Provincial governors with near absolute power, but strict accountability. Roman governors of provinces held nearly absolute power over their territories, commanding legions, collecting taxes, and administering justice. But they served limited terms and faced strict audits afterward, with corrupt governors regularly prosecuted and exiled. Provincial governors, called proconsuls or propraetors, depending on the province's importance, were essentially monarchs within their domains. They could wage war, make treaties, and issue edicts with the force of law. This concentration of power was necessary given the slow communication across the empire. Decisions couldn't wait weeks or months for approval from Rome. However, Rome developed checks on this power. Governors typically served one-year terms, though some received extensions. Upon returning to Rome, they faced examination of their conduct. Citizens and provincial delegations could bring charges of extortion or abuse. Cicero famously prosecuted the corrupt governor Verus, who had systematically plundered Sicily. The trial revealed that Verres had stolen artwork, extorted money from cities, and executed Roman citizens without trial. Verres went into exile rather than face conviction. Not all prosecutions succeeded. Wealthy governors could bribe juries or use political connections, but the system provided some accountability. Governors who enriched themselves moderately while maintaining order were often left alone, but those whose greed destabilized their provinces or embarrassed Rome faced serious consequences. This balance between local autonomy and central oversight allowed Rome to govern territories thousands of miles away with remarkably few administrators. Fact 64. Romans inventing the concept of corporations as legal entities. The concept of corporations as legal entities, separate from their owners and capable of owning property, entering contracts and being sued, was invented by Romans, who applied it to state-owned enterprises, religious organizations, and local governments. Roman law developed the idea of legal personhood for organizations, allowing them to act as unified entities rather than as collections of individuals. Municipalities could own public property, take out loans, and enter contracts in their own name. Religious organizations held property independently of individual priests. The Roman state created societates publica norum, companies of tax farmers who bid for the right to collect provincial taxes. These companies could have multiple investors, held property, and continued operating even as individual members changed, anticipating modern corporations. The concept of limited liability existed in limited form. Investors in certain ventures couldn't lose more than they invested. Romans also developed sophisticated partnership agreements, joint ventures, and profit-sharing arrangements. When a societas dissolved, Roman law specified how to divide assets and liabilities. These legal innovations enabled commerce on an unprecedented scale, allowing merchants to pool capital for large ventures like shipping fleets or mining operations. After Rome fell, many of these concepts were lost until medieval Italian city-states rediscovered them in Roman legal texts. Modern corporate law, with its concepts of legal personhood, limited liability, and separation of ownership from control, evolved directly from Roman jurisprudence. Fact 65. Rome having no police force for most of its history. Rome had no police force for most of its history. Law enforcement in the city relied on private prosecution, with crime victims or their families responsible for catching criminals and bringing them to trial, though magistrates could intervene in serious cases. This might seem chaotic, but it reflected Roman values of personal responsibility and limited government. If someone stole from you, you had to catch them yourself, gather evidence, and bring charges before a magistrate. You'd prosecute the case yourself or hire an advocate like Cicero. For violent crimes, families could pursue justice independently or seek official intervention. The streets weren't entirely lawless. Various officials had limited enforcement powers. Aediles maintained public order during the day and could arrest people disrupting markets. The Tresviri Capitals handled executions and could arrest criminals caught in the act. Vigils, Rome's firefighters, also acted as night watchmen. But there was no proactive patrol force investigating crimes or maintaining order citywide. Wealthy Romans employed private security, bodyguards and enforcers who protected their property and interests. This system worked passably in the Republic when Rome was smaller, but as the city grew to over 1 million inhabitants, crime became a serious problem. Emperors gradually expanded official law enforcement, but Rome never developed anything like a modern police force. The absence of professional policing is striking to modern observers and reflects a fundamentally different conception of public order and state responsibility. Fact 66. The dictator office and how Caesar destroyed it. The office of dictator, which gave one man absolute power for 6 months during emergencies, was used successfully for centuries, until Julius Caesar was appointed dictator perpetuo, dictator for life, destroying the system by making the temporary permanent. The dictatorship was originally a safety valve for the Republic. When external invasion, civil unrest, or natural disaster threatened Rome's survival, Consuls could appoint a dictator with unlimited authority to handle the crisis. The dictator commanded all legions, overruled all magistrates, and his decisions were final. But the 6-month limit was sacred. Enough. Time to defeat an invading army or suppress a revolt, but not enough to establish a tyranny. Dictators like Cincinnatus became legendary for voluntarily relinquishing power even sooner. The system worked because of shared republican values and the expectation that the dictator would return to private life. Caesar shattered this understanding. After defeating his rivals in civil war, he was appointed dictator first for 10 years, then for life in 44 BCE. This made mockery of the office's purpose. If dictatorship was permanent, it was kingship by another name. Caesar's assassination 2 months later came partly from this violation of republican tradition. His heir Octavian learned from this mistake, never calling himself dictator, but instead accumulating power through traditional offices and the title Augustus. By destroying the dictatorship's temporary nature, Caesar demonstrated how republican institutions could be corrupted from within, transforming mechanisms of crisis management into tools of autocracy. Fact 67. Tax farming through corrupt publicani contractors. Roman taxation was farmed out to private contractors called publicani, who bid for the right to collect taxes in a province, paying Rome up front, then keeping whatever they could extract. A system that led to massive corruption and exploitation of provincial populations. Tax farming was brilliant from Rome's perspective. It guaranteed revenue without requiring a large bureaucracy. The state auctioned tax collection rights to the highest bidder. Publicani paid Rome's asking price immediately, then spent the year extracting as much as possible from provincials to turn a profit. With no oversight and no limits on collection methods, publicani became notorious for extortion. They'd demand taxes multiple times, impose bogus fees, and use violence against those who couldn't pay. Biblical references to tax collectors being hated sinners reflect this reality. They were collaborators, enriching themselves by oppressing their own people on behalf of foreign occupiers. The system was particularly pernicious because publicani needed armed enforcement, creating private armies accountable to no one. Provincial governors sometimes reined in the worst abuses, but governors themselves often had business relationships with publicani and profited from the arrangement. Julius Caesar reformed the system in some provinces, replacing publicani with salaried officials, but tax farming persisted in many areas. The system exemplifies how Rome could be simultaneously administratively sophisticated and brutally exploitative, efficient. Revenue collection and good governance weren't always aligned. Fact 68. Private citizens forbidden from using the government postal system. The Roman postal system, while efficient for government communications, was so expensive to maintain that private citizens were forbidden from using it. Ordinary people had to rely on travelers, merchants, or personal slaves to carry messages across the empire. The cursus publicus, which we discussed earlier, was exclusively for imperial business. Using it without authorization was a serious crime, punishable by fines or worse. Emperors occasionally granted access to favored individuals, but ordinary Romans had no government mail service available. This created a robust private system. Merchants traveling between cities would carry letters for a fee. Wealthy Romans sent trusted slaves as personal couriers. People waiting to sail to another province would post notices offering to carry correspondence. Some entrepreneurs established informal courier services along major trade routes. But communication remained slow and uncertain. Letters might take weeks or months, or never arrive at all. The wealthy had advantages here too, maintaining networks, friends and clients across the empire who'd forward correspondence. We possess letters from figures like Cicero and Pliny the Younger precisely because they had the resources to maintain extensive correspondence. But for ordinary people, sending a message to a relative in another province was difficult and expensive. This communication gap reinforced local identities. Most provincials never traveled far and received little information from beyond their immediate region. The limitation on information flow shaped how Romans experienced their empire, with most people living in relatively isolated local worlds despite being part of a continental system. Fact 69. The value of Roman citizenship and the Constitutio Antoniniana Roman citizenship was so valuable that entire cities would bribe Roman officials or provide military service for generations just to secure it. And the Constitutio Antoniniana of 212 CE, which granted citizenship to nearly all free inhabitants, fundamentally transformed the empire's character. In the Republic and early Empire, Roman citizenship meant legal protections, the right to own property under Roman law, exemption from certain taxes, and the right to appeal to the emperor. Non-citizens could be tortured during investigations. Citizens could not. When Paul of Tarsus declared civis Romanus sum, I am a Roman citizen, he invoked protections that saved him from execution. Cities competed for the status of Roman colonies, which granted collective citizenship. Auxiliary soldiers served 25 years to earn citizenship for themselves and their children. Some provincials purchased citizenship through bribes or forged documents. This exclusive status created a hierarchy: citizens at the top, Latin rights holders in the middle, and peregrini, foreigners, at the bottom. Emperor Caracalla's Constitutio Antoniniana changed everything, extending citizenship to virtually all free men in the empire. This wasn't pure generosity, it expanded the tax base and diluted citizenship's special status. Where citizenship had been a privilege defining Roman identity, it became a legal category nearly synonymous with being free. The reform helped integrate the empire, but also contributed to the dilution of Roman identity, as being a citizen no longer meant sharing specific cultural values or origins. By making everyone Roman, Caracalla made being Roman mean less. Fact 70. The Roman Senate's informal but immense power. The Roman Senate, though theoretically advisory, was packed with former magistrates and military commanders who collectively possessed immense wealth, political experience, and social prestige, making it the real power center of the Republic even without formal executive authority. The Senate's power came not from constitutional authority, but from tradition, wealth, and expertise. Senators were Rome's elite, men who'd held magistracies, commanded armies, governed provinces, and accumulated vast fortunes. When they advised magistrates, it was hard to ignore that advice coming from hundreds of the most powerful men in Rome. The Senate controlled finances, assigned provincial governorships, directed foreign policy, and could declare emergencies. Magistrates technically could ignore senatorial decrees, but doing so risked their political future and invited retaliation. The Senate's authority was social and informal, but nonetheless real. Augustus cleverly maintained this fiction while stripping real power. He consulted the Senate, showed respect, and preserved republican forms while ensuring they remained ceremonial. Later emperors were less subtle, with some treating the Senate with open contempt. But the Senate's cultural prestige persisted for centuries. Membership remained the ultimate social achievement. Even powerless, senators clung to their dignity and traditions. The Senate's transformation from republic powerhouse to imperial rubber stamp illustrates how political institutions can persist long after their substance evaporates, maintaining forms while losing function. The Roman Senate formally existed until 603 CE, over 1,000 years after its founding. Though by then, it wielded no real power whatsoever. Transition, 70 Crane. Rome's governance systems, sophisticated as they were, ultimately couldn't solve the empire's deepest challenge: its sheer size and diversity. Managing an empire spanning 3 continents with ancient technology and communications was an almost impossible task. In our next segment, we'll explore how Rome dealt with the frontiers, the barbarians beyond them, and the beginning of the pressures that would eventually tear the empire apart. Set 8. Frontiers, Barbarians, and Decline. Fact 71. Hadrian's Wall is a customs barrier rather than pure military fortification. Hadrian's Wall, built starting in 122 CE across northern Britain, wasn't primarily a military fortification, but rather a customs barrier controlling trade and movement, with gates every Roman mile allowing controlled passage between the Roman and barbarian worlds. The wall stretched 73 miles from coast to coast, standing up to 15 feet high in places with a ditch on the northern side and a military road on the south. Every Roman mile, roughly 1,000 paces, stood a small fortress called a mile castle garrisoning, about 30 soldiers, and between each pair of mile castles were 2 observation towers. But the wall had gates, and those gates saw constant traffic. Northern tribes traded goods, Roman merchants ventured north, and people crossed regularly for various reasons, all under Roman supervision. Soldiers inspected cargo, collected customs duties, and monitored who passed through. The wall was as much about economic control as defense. It demonstrated Rome's power, marked the edge of civilization in Roman eyes, and allowed Rome to profit from cross-border trade while preventing unauthorized movement. Behind the wall, a zone of forts housed the actual garrison, about 10,000 troops who could respond to threats. The wall itself was a tripwire and checkpoint, not an impenetrable barrier. This sophisticated approach to border management anticipated modern border control concepts by nearly 2,000 years. Hadrian's Wall still stands today, the most impressive Roman monument in Britain. Fact 72. The origin of the term barbarian from barbar sounds. The term barbarian comes from the Greek word barbaros, adopted by Romans to describe anyone who didn't speak Latin or Greek. The word itself is onomatopoeia mimicking foreign languages as barbar, essentially calling non-Romans unintelligible babblers. Romans divided the world into civilized and barbarian, with civilization defined by language, literacy, urban living, and adherence to Roman or Greek culture. Being a barbarian wasn't necessarily about ethnicity. A Gaul who adopted Roman customs, learned Latin, and lived in a city could become civilized, while a Roman who abandoned urban life might be called barbaric. This cultural, rather than racial, definition meant Rome could assimilate conquered peoples relatively easily. However, Roman attitudes toward barbarians were complex and contradictory. They simultaneously viewed barbarians as primitive, violent, and inferior, while also romanticizing them as possessing natural virtues corrupted civilization had lost: courage, honesty, and physical vigor. Roman writers like Tacitus praised Germanic tribes' martial prowess and simple morality, while depicting them as dangerous and uncivilized. As Rome grew weaker and increasingly relied on barbarian soldiers, these attitudes became problematic. By the 4th and 5th centuries, barbarian generals commanded Roman armies, barbarian kingdoms controlled former Roman territories, and the distinction between Roman and barbarian had blurred significantly. The word survives today, still carrying connotations of violence and cultural inferiority, though its Roman context of cultural rather than racial definition is largely forgotten. Fact 73. Rome's natural defensive borders, rivers, desert, ocean. Rome's borders remained relatively stable for centuries, not because of military might alone, but because they followed natural defensive barriers, the Rhine and Danube rivers in the north, the Sahara Desert in the south, and the Atlantic Ocean in the west, and stopped expanding once reaching them. Roman expansion wasn't random, it was strategic. Rivers provided natural barriers that were easy to defend and difficult for large armies to cross. The Rhine-Danube frontier, over 2,500 miles long, used rivers as natural moats with forts positioned at crossing points. Ships patrolled the rivers, providing rapid troop movement and communication. In North Africa, Roman territory extended only to the edge of arable land. Beyond lay desert that couldn't support large populations or armies. The Atlantic coast marked an obvious western limit. Only in the east did Rome lack clear natural boundaries, making Persia a constant threat. When emperors tried to push beyond these natural frontiers, like Trajan's conquest of Dacia beyond the Danube, or failed attempts to conquer Scotland, the gains were difficult to maintain and often abandoned. Augustus, after the Teutoburg disaster, supposedly advised future emperors to keep the empire within its existing bounds. This restraint wasn't weakness, but strategic wisdom. Defending compact, naturally bounded territory required fewer troops than endless expansion. The frontiers weren't lines on maps, but transition zones where Roman authority gradually faded. As long as these natural barriers held and frontier troops remained loyal, the empire was secure. But when external pressure increased and internal cohesion weakened, these same barriers became indefensible perimeters. Fact 74. The crisis of the 3rd century, with 26 emperors in 50 years. The crisis of the 3rd century, 235–284 CE, saw 26 different men claim the imperial throne in just 50 years, with the empire fragmenting into 3 separate states and nearly collapsing completely before being rescued by military reforms. This period was Rome's darkest hour before the final fall. The crisis began when Emperor Severus Alexander was assassinated by his own troops in 235 CE, triggering decades of civil war. Generals across the empire declared themselves emperor, leading armies against each other, while external enemies invaded weakened frontiers. Germanic tribes crossed the Rhine and Danube. Persia conquered Roman territory in the east. Plague swept the empire. Economic collapse followed as civil wars disrupted trade and emperors debased currency to pay soldiers. The empire briefly split into 3 pieces. The Gallic Empire controlling Britain, Gaul and Spain, the Palmyrene Empire controlling Syria and Egypt, and a rump Roman state in Italy. Some emperors ruled for just weeks before being assassinated. The Senate became irrelevant as soldiers made and unmade emperors. Urban populations declined, cities shrank behind hastily built walls, and the complex economic system of the early empire collapsed into localized subsistence. Emperor Aurelian, 270–275 CE, reunited the empire through military conquest, and Diocletian, 284–305 CE, reformed the system, dividing the empire into eastern and western halves and establishing the tetrarchy. 4 emperors ruling jointly. Rome survived, but it emerged fundamentally transformed, more militarized, bureaucratic and authoritarian. Fact 75. Constantine's conversion transforming Christianity's status emperor. Constantine's conversion to Christianity in 312 CE and subsequent legalization of the religion transformed Christianity from a persecuted, minority faith into the dominant religion of the empire within just a few decades. Constantine's conversion was dramatic. Before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, he reportedly saw a vision of a cross in the sky with the words, "In this sign, conquer." He had his soldiers paint Christian symbols on their shields and won a decisive victory. Whether genuine religious experience or political calculation, Constantine's support revolutionized Christianity's status. The Edict of Milan in 313 CE granted religious tolerance to Christians, ending persecution. Constantine returned confiscated property, funded church construction, exempted clergy from taxes, and presided over the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, which established orthodoxy Christian doctrine. Suddenly, being Christian became advantageous rather than dangerous. The imperial court converted, followed by the aristocracy seeking favor, then urban populations. Pagan temples were gradually closed or converted to churches. By 380 CE, Emperor Theodosius made Christianity the empire's official religion and banned pagan worship. This transformation reshaped Western civilization. The church inherited Roman administrative structures, with bishops governing territories, called dioceses, Roman administrative units. Latin remained the church's language. Roman law influenced canon law. When the Western Empire collapsed, the church preserved Roman culture, literacy, and organization. Christianity's triumph was one of Rome's most enduring legacies, though it came at the cost of suppressing the polytheistic traditions that had defined Rome for centuries. Fact 76. The permanent split into Eastern and Western empires in 395 CE, the division of the Roman Empire into Eastern and Western halves in 395 CE, was meant to be administrative, not permanent. But the two halves grew increasingly separate in language, culture, and governance, with the East thriving while the West collapsed. Diocletian had established the tetrarchy with multiple emperors ruling different regions, but this system collapsed in civil war. Constantine briefly reunited the empire, but his successors divided it again, with the final split coming when Emperor Theodosius died in 395 CE, leaving the eastern half to his son Arcadius and the western half to his son Honorius. The east, centered on Constantinople, controlled wealthy provinces like Egypt, Syria, and Asia Minor. Its population spoke primarily Greek, its economy thrived on Eastern trade, and it maintained effective administration. The west, centered on Rome and later Ravenna, faced constant barbarian invasions, economic decline, and political instability. Latin speakers and Greek speakers could barely understand each other. The Eastern Emperor had no authority over the West and vice versa. They sometimes cooperated against common enemies, but often ignored each other or even conflicted. When Rome fell in 476 CE, Constantinople barely reacted. It was a distant relative's problem. The Eastern or Byzantine Empire continued for another 1,000 years, preserving Roman law, administration, and culture. The split revealed that the Roman Empire had become two different civilizations sharing a common origin but diverging destinies. Modern historians often treat them as separate entities, though Byzantines always called themselves Romans and maintained legal continuity with the ancient empire. Fact 77. The Huns creating a domino effect, pushing Germanic tribes into Rome. The Huns, a nomadic people from Central Asia, created a domino effect by pushing Germanic tribes into Roman territory, which increased pressure on Rome's frontiers and accelerated the Western Empire's collapse. The Huns appeared in Europe around 370 CE, horse-mounted warriors whose composite bows could kill at 200 yards, and whose mobility made them nearly impossible to fight using Roman tactics. They conquered or displaced Gothic tribes living north of the Danube. In 376 CE, desperate Gothic refugees numbering perhaps 200,000 requested permission to settle inside Roman territory, promising to serve in Roman armies. Rome agreed, but corrupt officials exploited the refugees, selling them dog meat at extortionate prices and enslaving their children. The Goths revolted. At the Battle of Adrianople in 378 CE, Gothic cavalry destroyed a Roman army and killed Emperor Valens, one of Rome's worst military defeats. Rome eventually settled the Goths as foederati, allied peoples, within the empire, in dangerous precedent of allowing armed barbarian groups to settle in Roman territory. The Huns themselves invaded under Attila in the 440s, 450s, ravaging both Eastern and Western empires before Attila's death caused their confederation to collapse. But the damage was done. Multiple barbarian groups now lived within Roman borders as semi-independent kingdoms. The frontier had essentially moved inside the empire. These groups initially served Rome, but gradually established their own authority, culminating in Germanic generals deposing the last Western Roman emperor in 476 CE. Fact 78. The anticlimactic fall of Rome in 476. C. The fall of Rome in 476 CE was so anticlimactic that many contemporaries barely noticed. The Germanic general Odoacer simply deposed the teenage emperor Romulus Augustulus, sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, and declared himself king of Italy. There were no burning cities, no dramatic last stand, no cataclysmic battle. The Western Roman Empire didn't fall, it just faded away. By 476, the Roman army was composed almost entirely of Germanic soldiers commanded by Germanic generals. The emperor had no real power, controlling only Italy, while Spain, Gaul, Britain, and North Africa were ruled by barbarian kingdoms that nominally acknowledged Roman authority but acted independently. When Odoacer deposed 16-year-old Romulus, Augustulus, whose diminutive name meant Little Augustus, even his name was a joke, he claimed he was simplifying administration, not ending Rome. He ruled as king of Italy, but maintained Roman institutions, laws, and administration. The Senate continued meeting. Aqueducts still flowed. Life in Rome changed surprisingly little. The Eastern Emperor theoretically ruled the whole empire now, making the Western Empire's end technically just an internal reorganization. Most Romans probably didn't realize their empire had fallen until historians later marked 476 CE as the end. The date is convenient, but somewhat arbitrary. The transformation from Roman Empire to Germanic kingdoms was gradual, spanning decades. Some historians argue the empire didn't truly end until the Byzantine Empire fell in 1453 CE, over 1,000 years later. Fact 79. The Byzantine Empire continuing for 977 more years. The Byzantine Empire, what we call the Eastern Roman Empire, continued for another 977 years after Rome's fall, preserving Roman law, administration, and culture, while developing a distinct Greek Christian civilization that bridged ancient and medieval worlds. Byzantines never called themselves Byzantine. They were Romans. Their empire was the Roman Empire, and their emperor was the Roman emperor. The term Byzantine was invented by Renaissance historians to distinguish the medieval Greek-speaking Christian empire from the ancient Latin-speaking pagan one. But to people living in Constantinople, there was no break, no new empire, just continuity. Byzantine emperors commissioned legal codes based on Roman law. They maintained Roman administrative divisions. They claimed authority over the entire former Roman Empire, including the barbarian kingdoms in the west. Justinian, 527–565 CE, even temporarily reconquered Italy, North Africa, and parts of Spain, briefly reuniting much of the old empire. Byzantine culture blended Roman political traditions, Greek language and philosophy, and Christian theology into something unique. They preserved classical texts that the West lost, maintained literacy when Western Europe descended into the Dark Ages, and developed sophisticated diplomacy and statecraft. When Constantinople finally fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, it marked the true end of the Roman state, 2,306 years after the legendary founding in 753 BCE. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine V, died fighting on the walls, his body never found. A fitting end for the final Roman emperor. Fact 80. Multiple interconnected factors causing Rome's fall resulted not from a single cause, but from multiple interconnected factors. Military overextension, economic crisis, political instability, disease, climate change, and barbarian invasions, a perfect storm of pressures that no ancient state could have survived. Historians have debated Rome's fall for 500 years, proposing over 200 different explanations. The truth is complex. Militarily, defending thousands of miles of frontier against increasing barbarian pressure required massive armies Rome could no longer afford. Economically, continuous warfare disrupted trade, debased currency caused inflation, and heavy taxation impoverished the population. Politically, the imperial system produced weak, short-lived emperors who couldn't provide stable leadership. The Antonine Plague, 165–180 CE, and later pandemics killed millions, devastating the tax base and army recruitment. Recent research suggests climate change, a cooling period called the Late Antique Little Ice Age, reduced agricultural productivity, causing food shortages and population decline. Barbarian invasions increased, partly because climate change was affecting Central Asian steppes, pushing nomadic peoples westward. Lead poisoning from plumbing may have affected elite health and decision-making. Christianity's spread weakened traditional Roman military values and redirected resources to churches rather than defense. The empire's sheer size made it ungovernable with ancient technology. No single factor caused the fall. Each reinforced the others in a downward spiral. Rome didn't die from one wound, but from 1,000 cuts, each making the empire less able to handle the next crisis. Understanding this complexity teaches us that great civilizations rarely fall from single causes, but from cascading system failures. Transition. 80. Despite its fall, Rome never truly died. Its legacy permeates every aspect of modern Western civilization and much of the world beyond. In our final segments, we'll explore Rome's lasting influence on language, law, architecture, engineering, and culture, and why, even 1,500 years after its fall, we're still talking about the Roman Empire. Set 9. Rome's enduring legacy. Fact 81, 80+. Modern cities founded by Romans still following Roman street grids. Over 80 modern cities, were founded by Romans as military camps or colonies, including London, Londinium, Paris, Lutetia, Vienna, Vindobona, Cologne, Colonia, and Barcelona, Barcino, many still following their original Roman street grid plans. When Romans established settlements, they followed standardized layouts based on military camp design. Two main roads intersected at right angles, the Cardo, north-south, and Decumanus, east-west, with a grid of smaller streets forming rectangular blocks. The Forum occupied the central intersection. This rational urban planning influenced city development for centuries. Modern London's financial district still follows Roman street patterns laid out 2,000 years ago. In Cologne, you can walk streets positioned exactly where Roman surveyors marked them. Barcelona's Gothic quarter preserves its Roman grid. These weren't just military outposts, but fully developed cities with forums, temples, bathhouses, theatres and aqueducts, transplanting Roman civilization to frontier regions. Many cities retained their Roman names with modifications. Chester, Winchester and Gloucester in England all come from castra, camp. The Chester, Castor and Cester endings identify former Roman sites. In France, cities ending in -aci or argues often mark Roman foundations. Even city names changed beyond recognition, like Eboracum becoming York, preserve Roman origins in archaeological remains. Roman urban planning principles, grid layouts, central public spaces, zoning for different activities, remain fundamental to city design worldwide. When modern urban planners design new developments, they're often unconsciously following Roman precedents established 2 millennia ago. In fact, 82. Catholic Church structure directly mirroring Roman imperial administration. The Catholic Church's organizational structure directly mirrors Roman imperial administration. Dioceses were Roman administrative units. Bishops took their titles from Roman officials, and the Pope's title, Pontifex Maximus, was originally the chief priest of Roman state religion held by emperors. When Christianity became Rome's official religion, it didn't reinvent organization. It absorbed Roman structures. The empire was divided into administrative regions called dioceses, each governed by officials. The Church adopted these exact territories, placing bishops in former administrative centers. The word diocese itself is Roman. Bishops took over many civic functions as imperial administration collapsed, making the transition seamless. The Church's hierarchy, pope, cardinals, archbishops, bishops, priests, parallels Roman governmental ranks. Canon law developed from Roman legal principles and procedures. Church Latin preserved classical pronunciation and grammar. Even architectural elements transferred. Basilicas, originally Roman public buildings for courts and commerce, became the template for church architecture. The Pope, as Bishop of Rome, claimed primacy partly based on Rome's political importance. The title Pontifex Maximus, meaning greatest bridge builder, referred to the chief priest who maintained Rome's sacred bridges and religious traditions. Julius Caesar held this title, as did Augustus and later emperors. When Emperor Gratian rejected it as incompatible with Christianity in the 4th century, the Bishop of Rome eventually adopted it. Today's Pope still uses this pagan Roman title. The Church didn't just survive Rome's fall. It became Rome's successor, preserving Roman organizational genius in religious form. Fact 83. Roman numerals persisting for prestige and tradition. Roman numerals, despite being replaced by Arabic numerals for calculation, remain embedded in modern culture for clock faces, book chapters, movie copyright dates, Super Bowl numbering, and formal documentation, maintaining a 2,000-year-old system for prestige and tradition. The Roman numeral system, IVXLCDM, representing 1, 5, 10, 50, 100, 500, and 1,000, is actually quite awkward for arithmetic. Try multiplying XT5 by XCY in Roman numerals, and you'll understand why merchants adopted Arabic numerals immediately when they arrived in Europe. Romans themselves used abacuses for calculation, treating numerals primarily as notation, but Roman numerals conveyed gravitas, permanence, and classical authority. They marked monuments, inscribed tombstones, and dated important documents. This association with significance persisted. Using Roman numerals suggests seriousness and timelessness. Thus, movie studios use them for copyright dates. MCMX 7 feels more impressive than 1997. Formal documents use them for main sections, and the Super Bowl resisted changing to Arabic numerals because Super Bowl 50 lacked the grandeur of Super Bowl L. Clock faces traditionally use Roman numerals, maintaining a connection to antiquity. Buildings display cornerstones with Roman numeral dates. Monarchs and popes use them to distinguish rulers with the same name, Elizabeth II, John Paul II. Even the practice of using Roman numerals for main divisions and Arabic numerals for subdivisions in outlines originates from medieval manuscripts copying Roman conventions. We keep Roman numerals not because they're useful, they're objectively inferior for math, but because they signal importance, tradition, and connection to classical civilization. Fact 84. Roman architectural elements, domes, arches, columns, symbolizing power today. The architectural elements we associate with grand buildings, domes, arches, columns, vaults, were either invented or perfected by Romans and were deliberately revived during the Renaissance and continue to symbolize power and importance in government buildings worldwide. Romans revolutionized architecture through engineering innovation. They perfected the arch, allowing buildings to span vast spaces without internal supports. They developed the dome, culminating in the Pantheon's 142-foot concrete dome. They created barrel vaults and groin vaults that distributed weight efficiently. These weren't just functional, they were symbolic. A building, with columns, arches, and domes, declared, "This is important, this is permanent, this is powerful." When Rome fell, these techniques were partially lost in the West, though preserved in Byzantium. The Renaissance deliberately revived Roman architectural principles, studying ancient buildings and Vitruvius's treatise De Architectura. This neoclassical style became associated with Enlightenment values and democratic ideals, ironic given Rome's imperialism. The U.S. Capitol, with its massive dome and columns, deliberately evokes Rome, as does the Lincoln Memorial's temple form. Supreme courts, parliaments, and government buildings worldwide use Roman architectural vocabulary to project authority. Banks adopted neoclassical design to suggest stability and permanence. Museums use it to convey cultural importance. Even modern buildings incorporate Roman elements, arches, columns, domes, because these forms still communicate prestige after 2 millennia. Roman architecture isn't just aesthetically influential. It's a visual language of power that transcends time and culture. Fact 85. Hundreds of Latin words and phrases in everyday English. Hundreds of English words and phrases come directly from Latin without translation. Etc. Per capita, ad hoc, alumni, via, versus, circa, ego, de facto, bona fide, status quo. We're essentially bilingual without realizing it. Latin permeates educated English so thoroughly that we switch between languages mid-sentence. Legal terminology is overwhelmingly Latin. Habeas corpus, you shall have the body. Subpoena, under penalty. Affidavit, he has sworn. Pro bono, for the good. Medical terminology uses Latin anatomical terms. Femur, tibia, in cerebellum, intestine. Academic life operates in Latin. Cum laude, with praise. Magna cum laude, summa cum laude, alumnus, alumni, emeritus, campus, curriculum, diploma. Botanical and biological classification uses Latin exclusively. Every species has a Latin scientific name. Mottos and inscriptions favor Latin for gravitas, e pluribus unum, out of many, one. Semper fidelis, always faithful. Carpe diem, seize the day. Even casual conversation includes Latin phrases vice, versa, aeschim, id est, that is, e.g. Exempli gratia, for example, etc., etc., and the rest. P.S., postscriptum, after writing. We say things are de rigueur or non sequitur without thinking we're speaking a dead language. This Latin layer in English signals education and precision. Using the Latin phrase often carries more weight than its English equivalent. Rome conquered Western Europe militarily, but it conquered the entire Western intellectual tradition linguistically. Fact. 86. Rule of law as a Roman innovation. The concept of rule of law, that laws should apply equally to everyone, including rulers, is a Roman innovation codified in the principle that the emperor is bound by the laws, even though emperors regularly violated this in practice. Roman legal philosophy developed the revolutionary idea that law existed independent of individuals, even powerful ones. The jurist Ulpian wrote that the emperor's decisions had the force of law, but also that the emperor acknowledged being bound by laws. This tension, autocratic power constrained by legal principles, created interesting paradoxes. Emperors who blatantly violated laws risked being seen as tyrants. The ideal emperor ruled according to law, presenting despotic decisions as legally justified. This established a precedent. Legitimate authority required legal justification. Medieval kings claimed divine right, but also insisted they ruled according to law. The Magna Carta forced King John to acknowledge that even kings weren't above law. Enlightenment philosophers, reading Roman legal texts, developed theories of constitutional government where law constrained rulers. The US Constitution's checks and balances reflect Roman-influenced ideas about limiting power through law. Modern democracies enshrine rule of law as fundamental. Governments must justify actions legally, courts can overturn government decisions, and officials can be prosecuted. When we say, "No one is above the law," we're echoing a principle Roman jurists articulated 2,000 years ago, even if Roman emperors honored it more in theory than practice. The gap between Rome's legal ideals and political reality doesn't diminish the ideals' importance. They provided a framework future societies could build upon. Fact 87. Roman engineering techniques unsurpassed until the Industrial Revolution. Roman engineering techniques were so advanced that some weren't matched until the Industrial Revolution. Their concrete, their understanding of hydraulics, their road-building methods remained unsurpassed for over 1,000 years after Rome's fall. Medieval engineers couldn't replicate Roman achievements. The recipe for Roman concrete was lost, and buildings were constructed using inferior materials and techniques. Aqueducts fell into disrepair and couldn't be rebuilt. Road maintenance declined until Roman roads crumbled, and new roads were primitive by comparison. The Dark Ages represented technological regression, not progress. Medieval builders looked at Roman ruins in awe and incomprehension, treating them as supernatural constructions rather than human engineering. They quarried Roman buildings for stone, destroying monuments they couldn't replicate. Only the Renaissance began recovering Roman knowledge, studying Vitruvius's writings and measuring ancient buildings to understand their principles. But even then, replicating Roman concrete eluded engineers until the 20th century. The Portland. Cement used in modern construction is actually inferior in some ways. Roman concrete grows stronger over centuries, while modern concrete deteriorates. Roman understanding of arches, domes, and weight distribution wasn't matched until the 18th and 19th centuries. Their hydraulic engineering, the pont de garde's precise gradient maintaining water flow, the sophisticated valve systems in bathhouses, required calculus and engineering principles that wouldn't be rediscovered until modern times. This 1,000-year gap represents one of history's greatest knowledge losses. Had Roman engineering knowledge been preserved, European development might have accelerated dramatically. Instead, medieval Europe laboriously rediscovered what Rome had known. Fact 88. Triumphal arches as a lasting symbol of victory. The tradition of triumphal arches commemorating military victories used by Napoleon, Nazi Germany, North Korea, and countless nations originated in Rome, where generals who'd conquered new territories celebrated with massive parades through arches specially built for the occasion. A Roman triumph was theatre on a colossal scale. The victorious general, dressed as Jupiter with face painted red, rode a golden chariot pulled by 4 white horses through Rome while crowds cheered. Behind him walked a slave whispering, "Memento mori," remember you are mortal, to prevent hubris. Captured enemy leaders were displayed in chains, sometimes executed after the parade. Wagons carried looted treasures and artwork. Elephants, exotic animals, and prisoners of war paraded past citizens. The procession passed through specially constructed triumphal arches decorated with sculptural reliefs depicting battle scenes. These temporary wooden arches eventually became permanent stone monuments. The Arch of Titus, celebrating Jerusalem's conquest, still stands, showing Roman soldiers carrying the Jewish temple's menorah. The Arch of Constantine commemorates his civil war victory. Triumphal arches communicated imperial power visually. Anyone passing through was reminded of Roman military dominance. Later rulers adopted this symbolism. Napoleon built the Arc de Triomphe after conquering Europe. The Arc de Triomphe du Carrousel celebrates his victories. Dictators worldwide copied the form. North Korea's Arch of Triumph is taller than Paris's. Washington, D.C.'s Triumphal Arch tradition appears in memorials. Even commercial architecture adopts the form. Hotels and casinos use triumphal arches to suggest grandeur. The triumphal arch's meaning is universal: victory, power, permanence. Every time you see one, you're witnessing Roman iconography adapted to modern purposes. Fact 89. Month and day names derived from Roman gods and rulers. The names of months and days come from Roman gods and rulers. July and August honor Julius Caesar and Augustus, while January through December mostly derive from Latin, preserving Rome's calendar in every date we write. Our calendar is fundamentally Roman. January honors Janus, god of beginnings and doorways. March honors Mars, god of war, originally Rome's first month when campaign season began. May possibly honors Maia, goddess of growth. June honors Juno, queen of gods. July was originally Quintilis, fifth month. Romans started counting from March, but was renamed for Julius Caesar. August was Sextilis, sixth, renamed for Augustus. September through December literally means seventh through 10th month, septem. Octo novem decem, but are now the 9th through 12th months, because January and February were added later. Days of the week come from Roman god names filtered through Germanic equivalents. Moon Day, Latin, dies lunae. Mars Day becomes Taus Day, Tuesday. Mercury Day becomes Woden's Day, Wednesday. Jupiter Day becomes Thor's Day, Thursday. Venus Day becomes Frigg's Day, Friday. Saturn Day, Saturn's Day, unchanged. Sunday dies Solis. The Romans even structured the week around planetary gods. The 7-day week reflects the 7 classical planets. Our calendar's quirks: why September isn't the 7th month, why February is short, why we have leap days, all trace to Roman calendar reforms. Every time you check your phone's date, you're using a system Julius Caesar designed, modified slightly by Pope Gregory III in 1582. 2,000 years later, Rome still tells us what day it is. Fact 90. Holy Roman Empire, claiming Roman legitimacy. For 1,000 years, the Holy Roman Empire, founded in 800 CE when Charlemagne was crowned Emperor of the Romans, claimed to be Rome's continuation for 1,000 years until Napoleon dissolved it in 1806, and the German Kaiser and Russian Tsar, titles both derived from Caesar, with rulers claiming Roman legitimacy 1,300 plus years after Rome's fall. Rome's prestige was so great that for over a millennium, European rulers desperately claimed Roman legitimacy. Charlemagne's coronation as Emperor of the Romans asserted that Rome's empire continued through him, though it controlled mainly Germanic territories. The Holy Roman Empire, as Voltaire quipped, was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, but its rulers insisted they were Rome's heirs. Otto Voigt revived the title in 962. Habsburg emperors continued claiming it until 1806. Meanwhile, Byzantine emperors in Constantinople insisted they were the real Romans, and they had a better claim given direct institutional continuity. When Constantinople fell in 1453, Moscow's grand princes declared Moscow the Third Rome, claiming to inherit Roman authority. Ivan IV took the title Tsar, a Slavic rendering of Caesar. German Kaiser comes from the same source. Even Napoleon crowned himself emperor, evoking Roman imperium. Every major European power at some point claimed Roman succession. Why? Because Rome meant legitimacy, civilization, and universal authority. A king ruled one people, an emperor ruled the world. That was the Roman model. Throughout medieval and early modern history, no title carried more prestige than claiming to be Rome's heir. The Holy Roman Empire's dissolution in 1806 and the last Tsar's fall in 1917 finally ended direct claims to Roman succession, but only after over 400 years of rulers insisting they were continuing Rome's legacy. Transition, 90 yam. We've journeyed through Roman history from mud huts on 7 hills to an empire spanning continents, from republic to empire to fall, and through 1,500 years of Roman legacy shaping our modern world. For our final segment, let's explore 10 more fascinating facts that capture the essence of why Rome continues to fascinate us, why we think about the Roman Empire, why it matters, and why its story remains relevant today. Final set. Final reflections. On Rome's legacy, fact 91. Rome's population of over 1 million unmatched in Europe until the 19th century. Rome's population of over 1 million inhabitants wasn't matched by any other European city until London in the 19th century. Paris didn't reach 1 million until 1850, meaning Rome remained Europe's largest city in history for over 1,800 years after its peak. At its height around 100 CE, Rome housed between 1 and 1.5 million people, an urban concentration unimaginable for ancient technology. Supporting this population required extraordinary infrastructure. 11 aqueducts delivering fresh water, the Tiber River for transport, grain fleets from Egypt and North Africa, massive warehouses, public baths, and sophisticated waste management. When Rome fell, its population collapsed to perhaps 20,000, 30,000 by the 6th century. Medieval Rome was a shadow, with ruins inhabited by a fraction of its former population. Medieval European cities were small. London in 1300 had maybe 80,000 people, Paris perhaps 200,000. Not until the Industrial Revolution enabled mass food production, modern sanitation, and efficient transportation could European cities again sustain populations Rome achieved with ancient technology. This population achievement reveals Roman organizational genius, coordinating food supply, water systems, law enforcement, and housing for 1 million people without computers, telephones, or modern bureaucracy. Rome's urban scale wasn't matched because the systems that made it possible, long-distance trade, professional administration, large-scale public works, collapsed with the empire and took over a millennium to rebuild. In the 92, all roads lead to Rome being literally true with the golden milestone. The phrase, all roads lead to Rome, is literally true. The Roman road network had Rome as its focal point, with distances measured from the golden milestone in the Forum, making Rome the exact center of their world in practical and symbolic terms. The Miliarium Aureum, or golden milestone, was erected by Augustus in the Forum, marking the point from which all distances in the empire were measured. Every milestone along every road stated its distance from this central point. Rome wasn't just the capital, it was literally the center of the universe in Roman cosmology. All trade routes converged on Rome. Armies marched toward or away from Rome. Grain ships sailed to feed Rome. Provincial taxes funded Rome. This centralization was both strength and weakness. It demonstrated Rome's importance, but also created vulnerability. When Rome weakened, the entire system shook. The phrase evolved into a metaphor, meaning multiple paths can lead to the same destination, but its literal origin reveals Roman worldview. They didn't just conquer territory, they organized it around themselves as the absolute center. Modern road networks don't work this way. They're distributed, with multiple hubs. But Roman roads literally radiated from Rome like spokes from a wheel hub. Even today, Italian highways follow routes established by Roman roads, making Rome a transportation hub, 1,000 years later. The golden milestone itself is lost, but its base remains in the Forum, marking the spot that was once, quite literally, the center of the Western world. Fact 93. Pompeii and Herculaneum, as perfectly preserved time capsules Pompeii and Herculaneum, buried by Vesuvius in 79 CE, provide such perfectly preserved snapshots of Roman life that we know more about daily life in these cities than in Rome itself, including preserved food, graffiti, and even loaves of bread frozen, in time for 2,000 years. When Vesuvius erupted, it killed thousands, but created an unintentional time capsule. Pompeii was buried under 1,320 feet of volcanic ash and pumice. Herculaneum was engulfed by superheated mud that carbonized organic materials, preserving wooden furniture, papyrus scrolls, and even food. Archaeologists found wine jars still sealed, bread in ovens, fish sauce in amphoras, and meals abandoned on tables. The ash preserved body shapes Giuseppe Fiorelli developed, a technique of pumping plaster into voids left by decomposed bodies, creating haunting casts of victims' final moments. A dog died, chained outside, still pulling against its leash. A family huddled in a building that collapsed on them. Gladiators, trapped in their barracks, tried to break through walls. These sites preserve details lost everywhere else: how shops were organized, what advertisements looked like, even ancient election posters. Graffiti reveals personal names, relationships, and daily concerns. Buildings stand multiple stories high with intact frescoes and mosaics. You can walk Roman streets exactly as Romans did, entering houses with their original layouts and decorations. Pompeii and Herculaneum are tragic disasters, turned into invaluable historical resources, catastrophe-preserved authenticity that careful archiving never could. Fact 94. Advanced Roman medicine, including surgery and field hospitals. Roman medicine was surprisingly advanced. They performed cataract surgery, developed over 200 surgical instruments still recognizable today, used antiseptic wine to clean wounds, and pioneered the concept of military field hospitals that could treat hundreds of injured soldiers. Roman military medicine was particularly sophisticated. Each legion had a medical corps, including medici, doctors, capsari, bandagers, and specialized surgical staff. They established valetudinaria, dedicated hospital buildings with separate wards, surgical theaters, and recovery rooms, a concept that wouldn't reappear in Europe for 1,000 years after Rome's fall. Archaeological excavations of Roman military hospitals show organized layouts with individual rooms for patients, central courtyards, and specialized treatment areas. Surgeons used instruments that look remarkably modern: scalpels, forceps, catheters, bone saws, and specula. They performed amputations, trephination, skull surgery, cataract removal by couching, pushing the clouded lens aside, and caesarean sections, though this last was usually fatal for the mother. Romans understood wound treatment, using vinegar and wine as antiseptics. They knew to clean and bind wounds promptly. Military doctors wrote medical texts, describing procedures and treatments. Galen, a Greek physician serving in Rome, made anatomical discoveries through gladiator treatment and animal dissection that remained authoritative for 1,500 years. Roman medicine had limitations. They didn't understand germ theory and had no effective anesthesia beyond alcohol and opium. But their practical surgical knowledge and systematic medical training exceeded anything available in medieval Europe until the late Renaissance. Fact 95. Romans. Inventing urban infrastructure we still use today. The Romans invented the apartment building, the shopping mall, the apartment rental market, the restaurant, the sports stadium, the public library, the free press, the newspaper, and the postal system, essentially creating the infrastructure of urban life we still use today. Rome pioneered urban modernity. Multi-story apartment buildings with ground-floor shops created mixed-use developments 2,000 years before modern city planning. Trajan's market functioned as the first shopping mall. Thermopolia were ancient fast food restaurants. The Circus Maximus and Colosseum established the model for modern stadiums: large capacity, efficient crowd management, dedicated venues for entertainment. Public libraries, established by emperors and wealthy donors, offered free access to scrolls and reading rooms. Daily news postings called Acta Diurna announced government decisions, military victories, and public events. The first newspapers, hand-copied and posted in public spaces. The cursus publicus created organized long-distance communication. Romans developed real estate markets with property rental, sale, and speculation. They had banking systems, insurance, and credit. Urban planning included zoning regulations, building codes, after fires proved the danger of shoddy construction, and public services. The infrastructure supporting 1 million urban residents required unprecedented organizational systems. When Rome fell, most of these innovations disappeared. Medieval cities were small, disorganized, and lacked basic services Romans took for granted. Only as European cities grew in the Renaissance did they rediscover the need for Roman-style urban infrastructure, and often turned to Roman models to rebuild it. Fact 96. The Roman Republic inspiring American government. The idea of a republic, representative government with checks and balances, separation of powers, and elected officials, serving limited terms, was Rome's political innovation, inspiring the American founding fathers who explicitly modeled the U.S. government on Roman precedents. The founding fathers studied Roman history intensively. They read Cicero, Livy, and Plutarch. They signed documents with Roman pseudonyms. The Federalist Papers were written by Publius. They debated whether America would repeat Rome's transformation from republic to empire. The Senate was deliberately named after Rome's Senate. The Capitol building's name comes from Rome's Capitoline Hill. The office of president, with veto power and commander-in-chief authority, parallels Roman consuls. The concept of separation of powers, executive, legislative, judicial, reflects Roman division between consuls, senate, and various assemblies and magistrates. Term limits came from Roman practice of annual magistracies. The peaceful transfer of power, so important to American democracy, echoes Roman consular succession. Even American symbols derive from Rome. The eagle, the fasces, bundle of rods symbolizing authority, unfortunately later adopted by fascism, and classical architecture for government buildings. The founders saw themselves as modern Romans, creating a republic that would avoid Rome's mistakes. They obsessively studied how Rome's republic fell into dictatorship, hoping to design better safeguards. America's constitutional system is fundamentally Roman in structure and inspiration, adapted for modern conditions but built on 2,000-year-old foundations. 97. Rome's concept of Western civilization itself, Rome's ultimate legacy, might be the concept of Western civilization itself. The idea that Europe, and by extension the Americas, share common cultural roots in Greco-Roman civilization, Christianity, and Enlightenment thought, all of which have Roman origins or passed through Rome. The West as a concept is essentially the Roman Empire plus its cultural descendants. Greek philosophy reached Europe through Rome, which preserved and transmitted Greek learning. Christianity emerged in the Roman Empire and spread along Roman roads and trade routes. The Renaissance was literally the rebirth of Roman culture and learning. The Enlightenment developed from studying Roman law and philosophy. Western languages are either Romance languages descended from Latin or, like English and German, heavily influenced by Latin vocabulary and grammar. Western legal systems derive from Roman law. Western architecture quotes and Roman forms. Western political thought traces through Roman Republic ideals. Western education traditionally required Latin and classical history. The concept of the West, separating European civilization from other world cultures, is itself a Roman inheritance. Romans divided the world into civilized, Greco-Roman, and barbarian, and this distinction persisted. Critics argue this overstates Roman influence and creates artificial cultural boundaries, noting that the West is more invention than reality, used to justify everything from colonialism to modern geopolitics. But whether we celebrate or critique it, the idea that European and American cultures share common roots, and that those roots are partly Roman, shapes how we understand ourselves and our world. Fact 98. Why people think about the Roman Empire so often, the viral meme. the modern internet meme. How often do men think about the Roman Empire became viral because it touched on a real phenomenon, Rome's history contains relatable human drama, moral lessons, and practical achievements that make it endlessly fascinating regardless of era. The meme, originating in 2023, asked women to ask men how often they think about the Roman Empire, with men admitting they think about it surprisingly often, daily or weekly. Why? Rome offers everything that makes history compelling. It has legendary origins, dramatic rises to power, larger-than-life personalities like Caesar and Cleopatra, spectacular architecture, innovative engineering, military conquest, political intrigue, moral philosophy, cautionary tales about power and corruption, and an epic fall. Men specifically relate to Roman military history, engineering achievements, and the archetype of the citizen soldier. But everyone finds something relatable. Rome had powerful women like Agrippina and Livia, had social dynamics recognizable today, dealt with immigration, struggled with political polarization, faced economic inequality, and ultimately failed despite being history's most powerful empire. Rome's story contains lessons about leadership, about institutional decay, about how civilizations rise and fall. It's simultaneously inspiring and terrifying. We think about Rome because Rome feels relevant. It was powerful yet fell, was sophisticated yet brutal, created beauty and horror simultaneously. Rome holds a mirror to human civilization, showing both our highest achievements and darkest impulses. That's why we can't stop thinking about it. Fact 99. Rome's belief in building for eternity, Rome's greatest gift to humanity, might be the belief that human achievement, organization, and will can create systems that outlast individuals. That we can build things meant to endure for centuries, not just our own lifetimes. Romans built for eternity. Their roads were engineered to last not decades but millennia. Their aqueducts were overbuilt, designed with redundancy and durability exceeding all functional requirements. Their monumental architecture announced, "This will stand forever." This mentality affected everything: legal codes meant to govern future generations, institutions designed to outlive their founders, public works intended as permanent gifts to humanity. The phrase Senatus Populusque Romanus, SPQR, the Senate and people of Rome, appeared on everything, asserting collective identity beyond individual emperors. Romans planted forests they'd never see mature to supply timber for future ships. They built infrastructure for cities that didn't yet exist. This long-term thinking is rare. Most societies focus on immediate needs. But Romans believed in building for permanence, creating systems and structures for descendants centuries hence. Modern society has largely lost this. We build disposably, plan in quarterly cycles, prioritize short-term gains. But when we do think long-term, about climate change, sustainable development, institutions that should outlast us, we're channeling Roman attitudes. The Roman attitude that humans can create lasting civilization, that current generations have obligations to future ones, that some things should be built to endure. This might be Rome's deepest legacy. Rome fell, but the idea that we can build something meant to last forever survives. Fact 100. Rome never truly ending. It transformed into modern civilization. Rome never actually ended. Its institutions, laws, languages, architecture, and cultural influence continue shaping human civilization today. Meaning, we're not studying ancient history, but rather the deep roots of our modern world, making Rome not a fallen empire, but an immortal idea. This is the ultimate truth about Rome. It didn't die, it transformed. The Roman Empire became the Catholic Church, preserving Roman organization and Latin language. It became the legal systems of dozens of nations. It became the Romance languages spoken by nearly 1 billion people. It became the architectural language of power and grandeur worldwide. It became the republican ideals underpinning modern democracies. It became the urban infrastructure model for modern cities. Every time you use a word derived from Latin, which is most of English vocabulary, Rome lives. Every time you see a domed government building, Rome lives. Every time courts reference legal precedents, Rome lives. Every time you count in Roman numerals, Rome lives. Every time engineers build something meant to last centuries, Rome lives. The Western calendar, the 7-day week, concepts of citizenship and law, the shape of our cities, the structure of our governments, all carry Roman DNA. Rome isn't history. It's the foundation we build. On understanding Rome isn't about memorizing dates and battles. It's about understanding ourselves, our institutions, and the deep structures shaping modern life. Rome fell as a political entity 1,548 years ago, but as an idea, as a cultural force, as a model of human achievement and hubris, Rome is immortal. We think about Rome not because we're nostalgic for the past, but because Rome isn't past. It's present, woven into the fabric of contemporary civilization. Rome fell, but Rome never ended. And that's why it remains the most fascinating civilization in human history. Conclusion, and there you have it, 100 facts about the Roman Empire, from its legendary founding by Romulus to its lasting influence on every aspect of modern life. We've journeyed through 1,000 years of history, explored engineering marvels and human drama, witnessed the rise and fall of the ancient world's greatest power, and discovered that Rome's legacy lives on in ways both obvious and subtle. Whether you think about the Roman Empire daily, weekly, or are only now beginning to understand its relevance, one thing is clear. Rome's story is humanity's story, a tale of ambition and achievement, innovation and destruction, glory and decline. It reminds us that even the mightiest civilizations are fragile, that power without wisdom leads to fall, and that the things we build, whether physical monuments or cultural institutions, can outlive their creators by millennia. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Roman history. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the empire that shaped our world, let me know in the comments which facts surprised you most and what other historical topics you'd like to explore. Remember, Rome wasn't built in a day, but hopefully these 100 minutes have given you a lifetime of appreciation for the civilization that, in many ways, built the world we live in today.